In the early 9th century, no one in Europe spoke of a Norman people. There were only Scandinavian raiders, unnamed in their origins, mobile by design, and politically fragmented. Yet, within 2 centuries, their descendants would rule England, Sicily, and Antioch. This transformation did not occur through chance, but through a precise convergence of geography, warfare, and institutional adaptation. In the 8th century, there was no people known as the Normans, no shared political identity, no defined territory, and no collective name connected the individuals who would later settle in northern Francia. Instead, their origins lay within the fragmented societies of Scandinavia, primarily in what is now Norway and Denmark, where geography, inheritance customs, and political instability produced conditions favorable to mobility and overseas expansion. Scandinavia in the early medieval period was characterized by limited arable land, dispersed settlements, and a harsh climate that constrained agricultural productivity. Archaeological surveys from Norway and Denmark indicate small farming communities concentrated along coastal plains and fjord systems. Population growth during the late Iron Age placed increasing pressure on available land, particularly in western Norway, where inheritance practices favored division among heirs. As landholdings diminished across generations, younger sons faced restricted access to property and status within their home communities. Written sources suggest that political authority in Scandinavia during this period was highly localized. Power was exercised by chieftains rather than centralized kings, and allegiance was personal rather than institutional. Assemblies such as the Thing governed legal disputes, but enforcement depended on kinship networks rather than standing authority. This fragmentation limited internal consolidation and encouraged outward expansion as a means of acquiring wealth, land, and followers. Archaeological evidence reinforces this picture of decentralized societies oriented toward maritime movement. Ship burials discovered at sites such as Oseberg and Gokstad demonstrate advanced shipbuilding techniques by the late 8th century. These vessels were long, shallow-drafted, and capable of both open-sea navigation and river travel. Their construction suggests a society that invested significant resources into mobility, not only for trade but also for warfare and migration. Weapon deposits recovered from burial sites and wetlands further indicate the normalization of raiding activity. Swords, spears, shields, and axes appear frequently in elite graves, suggesting that martial capability was closely tied to social status. At the same time, the absence of standardized military organization points towards small-scale expeditions rather than state-directed campaigns. Raiding parties were typically organized by individual leaders who attracted followers through promises of shared spoils. Maritime technology enabled Scandinavians to exploit river systems that penetrated deep into continental Europe. The Baltic Sea, North Sea, and Atlantic coastline formed an interconnected network of routes linking Scandinavia to the British Isles and the Frankish world. These waterways allowed raiders to bypass fortified frontiers and strike at monastic centers, trading towns, and riverine settlements with limited defenses. Contemporary Frankish sources provide the earliest written evidence of Scandinavian incursions. The Annals Bertiniani record repeated raids along the Seine during the 9th century, noting both the scale of destruction and the difficulty of repelling the attackers. These accounts emphasize mobility rather than occupation, describing fleets that appeared seasonally and withdrew with plunder rather than seeking immediate settlement. It is important to distinguish between contemporary records and later narrative traditions. Saga literature composed in Iceland centuries later offers detailed stories of Viking leaders and migrations, but these texts reflect retrospective memory shaped by later political realities. Modern historians treat such sources cautiously, relying instead on archaeological patterns and contemporary chronicles to reconstruct early Scandinavian activity. Archaeological settlement evidence indicates that early Scandinavian presence abroad was initially temporary. Seasonal camps along riverbanks and coastal estuaries have been identified through post holes, hearths, and artifact scatters. These sites lack permanent structures and reflect short-term occupation tied to raiding cycles. Over time, however, repeated use of certain locations laid the groundwork for longer-term settlement. Economic incentives played a central role in this transition. The Carolingian Empire, though politically fragmented after the death of Charlemagne, remained economically productive. Monasteries accumulated wealth in the form of precious metals, manuscripts, and food stores, making them attractive targets. River trade routes also offered opportunities for commerce, allowing Scandinavian groups to exchange slaves, furs, and amber for silver and luxury goods. Coin hoards discovered in Scandinavia provide material confirmation of these exchanges. Large quantities of Frankish and Islamic silver coins have been recovered from 9th century hoards, indicating sustained participation in long-distance trade networks. The circulation of foreign coinage suggests that Scandinavian economies were increasingly integrated into wider commercial systems rather than isolated subsistence models. Religious structures also influenced mobility. Pre-Christian Scandinavian belief systems did not impose centralized authority or territorial exclusivity. Religious practice was localized, centered on household and community rituals rather than institutional temples. This flexibility allowed migrants to adopt new religious identities without disrupting existing social frameworks, a factor that would later facilitate conversion to Christianity in settled regions. Leadership dynamics further encouraged expansion. Success in raiding enhanced prestige and attracted followers, creating feedback loops that rewarded outward movement. Leaders who failed to secure wealth or land risked losing support. This competitive environment favored aggressive expansion and experimentation beyond Scandinavia's geographic limits. By the late 9th century, Scandinavian activity in the Frankish world had become increasingly regularized. Some groups began overwintering along rivers rather than returning north. Archaeologists have identified fortified encampments or long forts that provided protection and logistical support for extended stays. These sites represent an intermediate stage between raiding and settlement. Despite these developments, there was still no unified Scandinavian identity abroad. Groups operated independently, formed temporary alliances, and shifted leadership frequently. Ethnic labels applied by Frankish chroniclers, such as Northmanni, were external designations rather than self-identifications. They described origin, not political cohesion. This distinction is essential for understanding the later emergence of the Normans. The individuals who would settle in northern Francia did not arrive as a coherent people with shared institutions. They were part of a broader Viking diaspora shaped by environmental pressures, technological capability, and political fragmentation. Their eventual transformation into a territorially rooted elite would depend on conditions encountered abroad rather than traditions carried intact from Scandinavia. By the end of the 9th century, Scandinavian mobility had become a structural feature of the North Atlantic and European river systems. Raiding, trading, and migration were interconnected processes rather than distinct phases. These dynamics set the foundation for permanent settlement in regions where local authorities chose negotiation over continued conflict. As Norse mobility increased, raids gradually evolved into permanent settlement abroad. Before continuing, you may subscribe to the channel and enable notifications to receive future Nightfall history documentaries as they are released. If a particular section stands out, you are welcome to note it in the comments. Your engagement helps support the continued production of long-form, research-driven historical content. By the early 9th century, Scandinavian fleets had become a permanent factor in Frankish politics. Following initial Scandinavian mobility, the Carolingian Empire experienced repeated incursions along its coastal and riverine territories. The period after Charlemagne's death in 814 CE was marked by political fragmentation, weakened central authority, and regional disputes among his successors. These conditions rendered the empire vulnerable to seaborne raiders who exploited rivers and estuaries to penetrate deep into Frankish lands. Contemporary sources, including the Annals Bertiniani, document attacks on monasteries, towns, and trade centers, describing both the scale and frequency of these raids with precise chronologies. For example, the monastery at Normutjur was attacked in 799, illustrating early patterns of mobility and opportunistic targeting of poorly defended sites. Scandinavian raiding strategies were heavily shaped by their maritime technology. Longships, designed with shallow drafts and high maneuverability, allowed attackers to navigate rivers such as the Seine, Loire, and Rhine, reaching locations hundreds of kilometers inland. Archaeological evidence, including remnants of ship burials in Norway and Denmark, demonstrates the sophistication of these vessels and their suitability for both coastal and inland operations. These ships provided speed, surprise, and logistical flexibility, enabling Scandinavian groups to conduct rapid attacks and retreat before local forces could respond effectively. Political weakness in the Frankish realm further amplified the threat. Following the partitioning of the Carolingian Empire by the Treaty of Verdun in 843 CE, local counts and dukes often lacked coordination, resources, or authority to mount a consistent defense. Capitularies issued by Frankish rulers reveal repeated efforts to legislate defense obligations, but enforcement was uneven. Monastic chronicles note that nobles sometimes negotiated directly with raiders, paying tribute or ransom to protect their holdings, reflecting the practical limits of centralized control. In some cases, Viking groups received permission to overwinter in secure locations, signaling a shift from purely predatory activity to semi-permanent occupation. Key strategic targets emerged along the Seine and adjacent coastal regions. Cities such as Rouen and Paris held economic and symbolic importance, housing trade centers, administrative offices, and ecclesiastical wealth. In 845 CE, a fleet under the Viking leader Reginhirus sailed up the Seine, reaching Paris itself. Frankish chronicles describe the king, Charles the Bald, paying a substantial tribute of silver to prevent the sacking of the city. Archaeologists have located contemporary fortifications along these river routes, suggesting that urban centers increasingly invested in defensive works, though these were often insufficient against highly mobile raiding parties. Repeated incursions contributed to a normalization of Scandinavian presence in northern Francia. Initially, raiders appeared seasonally, withdrawing to their homelands after plunder. Over time, however, they established temporary encampments along riverbanks and estuaries. Excavations at sites such as Quentavik and Cork illustrate the construction of semi-permanent shelters and storage facilities designed to support sustained operations. These developments foreshadowed the eventual acceptance of settlement agreements by Frankish rulers. Economic factors reinforced these patterns. Scandinavian raiders targeted monasteries, markets, and trading hubs that concentrated wealth. The circulation of Carolingian silver coinage, discovered in hoards across Scandinavia, indicates that raids were integrated into broader networks of trade and wealth accumulation. The combination of military mobility and economic opportunity made continued raids an attractive strategy for Scandinavian groups, while simultaneously pressuring Frankish authorities to consider negotiation over expulsion. The Carolingian response evolved in parallel. Rather than relying solely on military resistance, Frankish rulers increasingly adopted diplomatic measures. Treaties and oaths granted raiders land or safe harbor in exchange for loyalty or defense obligations. These arrangements were recorded in charters and annals, illustrating a pragmatic approach to frontier security. Such accommodations highlight a shift from reactive defense to negotiated settlement, a pattern that would set the stage for later permanent Scandinavian presence in the region. Raiding operations were often organized by small, semi-independent contingents under individual leaders. Contemporary chronicles frequently identify figures such as Reginhirus and Rollo, though exact genealogical and chronological details remain debated. These leaders coordinated fleets, assigned roles for assault and plunder, and established temporary bases to consolidate gains. Archaeological findings, including weapon deposits and recovered trade goods, corroborate written accounts, providing material evidence for both mobility and organized raiding activity. The integration of raiding and commerce was significant. Scandinavian groups did not solely rely on violence. They engaged in trade, exchanging slaves, furs, and amber for silver, textiles, and other luxury items. Numismatic evidence confirms that foreign coins circulated widely within Scandinavian hordes, reflecting a combination of raiding, tribute, and exchange networks. This dual strategy enhanced both economic stability and political influence abroad, enabling raiding leaders to maintain followings and secure resources necessary for further operations. Coastal and river defenses in the Carolingian realm adapted to these pressures. Fortified bridges, watchtowers, and garrison settlements emerged along vulnerable routes. Archaeological remains of palisades and earthen ramparts suggest a developing understanding of Scandinavian tactics and the necessity of permanent infrastructure. Despite these efforts, the mobility and tactical flexibility of Viking fleets often rendered defenses reactive rather than preventive. By the late 9th century, Scandinavian fleets were no longer isolated threats but integrated elements in the political calculus of northern Francia. Their capacity to strike at key urban and economic centers forced Frankish rulers to acknowledge their presence diplomatically and economically. Records indicate that tribute payments, temporary land grants, and negotiated safe havens became increasingly common, signaling a de facto recognition of Scandinavian influence along the Seine and other strategic corridors. The transformation from episodic raiding to structured occupation was gradual and contingent on both Frankish weaknesses and Scandinavian capabilities. Riverine mobility, political fragmentation, and economic incentives combined to create conditions in which the presence of Viking fleets became an accepted element of northern Frankish politics. Archaeological and textual evidence together document this evolution, illustrating how maritime technology, leadership, and strategic opportunism shaped early medieval European geopolitics. Persistent raiding and the establishment of temporary bases ultimately forced Frankish rulers toward negotiation rather than expulsion. This dynamic laid the groundwork for formal settlement agreements, including land grants to leaders such as Rollo, which would eventually give rise to the Duchy of Normandy. By the end of the 9th century, Scandinavian influence along the rivers of northern Francia had shifted from intermittent disruption to a recognized structural presence, setting the stage for the emergence of the Normans as a distinct political and territorial entity. In 911, a Frankish king chose accommodation over annihilation. By the early 10th century, Scandinavian raiding along the Seine had become a persistent structural challenge for the Carolingian kingdom. Frankish authorities, weakened by internal divisions and limited capacity to enforce centralized control, faced repeated incursions that threatened both economic stability and political legitimacy. In this context, Charles the Simple, king of West Francia, engaged in negotiations with the Viking leader Rollo, culminating in the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte in 911 CE. This agreement granted Rollo and his followers land along the lower Seine in exchange for loyalty and a commitment to defend the territory against further Scandinavian raids. The treaty represents a pragmatic adaptation by both parties. For Charles, the concession transformed a recurring threat into a buffer zone, protecting the heartland of the kingdom from continued incursions. Contemporary Frankish sources, including charters recorded in the Recueil de Historiens de Gaules et de la France, indicate that the land grant was formalized with oaths of fidelity. Rollo, for his part, secured a hereditary territorial base, legitimized by royal sanction, which provided the foundation for long-term settlement and governance. This arrangement marked a shift from episodic raiding toward integration within the political framework of northern Francia. Evidence for the treaty's implementation comes from both Frankish and Norman sources. While later narratives such as Dudo of St. Quintin's de Moribus et Actus Primorum Normanni Ducum offer detailed accounts of Rollo's life and oath-taking, these texts were composed decades after the events and include elements of legend and moral interpretation. Cross-referencing with contemporaneous Frankish annals allows historians to reconstruct the basic terms of the agreement while distinguishing retrospective embellishment. Scholars emphasize that the treaty codified both military obligations and territorial rights, establishing a precedent for formalized Viking settlement. Geographically, the land granted to Rollo encompassed the lower Seine Valley, including the towns of Rouen and surrounding territories. Control of these areas provided access to vital riverine routes, enabling economic integration through trade and taxation, while also securing defensible positions against both other Viking groups and local insurgents. Archaeological surveys in the region have identified early fortifications and settlement patterns consistent with Scandinavian occupation, including timber constructions typical of northern European traditions. These material remains corroborate written evidence of a permanent presence rather than continued transient raiding. The legal and political dimensions of the treaty were significant. By swearing loyalty to Charles, Rollo accepted obligations typical of vassalage, including military support and defense of the realm. Charters documenting grants of land further formalized these arrangements, providing a framework for property rights, inheritance, and the administration of justice. These mechanisms established a foundation for governance that would evolve into the Duchy of Normandy, linking Scandinavian settlers with established Frankish political structures. The treaty also had implications for regional security and diplomacy. By integrating Rollo's forces into the Frankish system, Charles effectively neutralized a recurrent threat while extending the kingdom's influence over peripheral regions. The arrangement demonstrates how negotiation and legal recognition could serve as alternatives to military confrontation, reflecting broader Carolingian strategies of accommodation in frontier zones. Monastic chronicles, such as those from St. Denis, note that this pragmatic approach reduced immediate threats to trade and ecclesiastical holdings, stabilizing key economic centers along the Seine. Implementation of the treaty required ongoing adaptation. While the formal agreement granted land, Rollo and his followers needed to establish administrative structures to govern and extract resources effectively. Early Scandinavian settlers maintained martial organization while gradually adopting local legal practices, including Frankish codes for property, taxation, and dispute resolution. Archaeological findings, including settlement layouts and fortifications, suggest that these hybrid administrative practices combined Scandinavian mobility and martial culture with Carolingian bureaucratic models, creating a uniquely Norman system. Religious integration formed another component of treaty implementation. Conversion to Christianity was encouraged and sometimes required for full participation in the political framework. Contemporary sources indicate that clerics played a role in legitimizing the settlement and administering sacral obligations, providing both spiritual and civic authority. Churches established within the granted territories facilitated interaction between Scandinavian settlers and the existing Frankish population, promoting cultural and social integration. The treaty's broader significance extends beyond immediate political accommodation. By formalizing Scandinavian settlement under royal authority, it created conditions for the gradual emergence of a distinct Norman identity. Settlers adopted Frankish language, law, and administrative techniques while retaining martial and maritime traditions inherited from Scandinavia. Over successive generations, this fusion of cultures produced a cohesive political and social entity capable of governing territory, raising armies, and engaging in external diplomacy. The agreement also influenced subsequent Frankish-Viking relations. Other leaders, observing the success of Rollo's settlement, were more likely to accept negotiated arrangements rather than engage in protracted raiding. Diplomatic precedent was thus established, with legal recognition, land grants, and military obligations forming the basis for frontier governance. This pattern would recur in other regions of Europe affected by Scandinavian migration, including Brittany and northern Italy, illustrating the treaty's broader historical impact. The treaty's immediate effect was to stabilize the lower Seine region. Local Frankish populations experienced reduced disruption from raiding, enabling trade, agriculture, and settlement to continue with greater security. Viking groups, in turn, gained legitimate claims to territory, which encouraged permanence over seasonal raids. Material evidence, including timber fortifications and settlement layouts, indicates that Scandinavian settlers constructed defensible sites and engaged in local administration. The combination of military capability, political recognition, and legal codification established the necessary conditions for durable governance. Despite the treaty's success, land grants alone did not create a fully stable polity. Ongoing negotiation, military readiness, and administrative development were required to consolidate authority over the granted territory. Dukes and local leaders had to maintain relationships with both the Frankish crown and indigenous populations, balancing external loyalty with internal control. These early administrative experiments would inform the evolution of the Duchy of Normandy, providing models for governance, taxation, and legal authority that endured for centuries. By formalizing Scandinavian settlement through negotiation, oath, and land grant, the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte created a framework that combined military pragmatism with legal authority. Archaeological evidence and contemporary charters confirm that Rollo's followers established permanent presence along the Seine, integrating into regional governance while retaining Scandinavian identity. This foundation enabled Normandy to emerge as a stable political entity, capable of both defending its territory and projecting influence beyond its borders. Land grants alone did not create a stable polity. Administration, integration, and adaptation were necessary for the Duchy of Normandy to develop into a durable and organized political structure. The Normans did not replace Frankish society, they absorbed it. Following the formalization of Rollo's settlement through the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte in 911 CE, Scandinavian settlers faced the challenge of transforming temporary raiding bands into a politically organized, territorially anchored society. Early Norman rulers adopted existing Frankish institutions, integrating local legal practices, administrative systems, and religious structures to establish stability and authority. This process of absorption enabled the Normans to maintain military readiness while legitimizing their presence within the broader Carolingian framework. One of the most visible aspects of integration was the adoption of Christianity. Contemporary charters and ecclesiastical records indicate that churches were constructed across key settlements in the Lower Seine region, often funded by ducal patronage. Foundations at sites such as Fécamp and Jumièges, corroborated by archaeological excavations, demonstrate continuity with earlier Carolingian church-building traditions. These foundations provided both spiritual authority and administrative centers, reinforcing the legitimacy of Norman rule while facilitating integration with the local population. Language and literacy also played a central role in governance. Rollo's followers gradually adopted the Old French vernacular and Carolingian Latin for administrative and legal purposes. Charters from the early 10th century document land grants, legal decisions, and tax obligations in forms recognizable to Frankish clerics and officials. The use of existing linguistic frameworks enabled efficient communication with indigenous populations, monastic authorities, and neighboring political entities, smoothing the transition from raiding to governance. Legal structures were similarly adapted rather than replaced. Scandinavian settlers observed local customary law, known as loi civique and related Frankish codes, in adjudicating disputes and regulating land tenure. The formalization of landholding arrangements, as evidenced in surviving charters, established hereditary claims for Norman lords while preserving obligations to the crown. By adopting and extending these practices, early Norman rulers avoided alienating the existing population and ensured continuity in taxation, justice, and social organization. Administrative innovation accompanied integration. The early dukes established networks of local representatives to oversee resource collection, defense, and dispute resolution. Archaeological evidence suggests the construction of fortified centers, timber palisades, and earthworks at strategic locations along the Seine. These structures served dual purposes, asserting Norman authority and providing defensive positions against external threats, including rival Scandinavian bands. Their design reflects a synthesis of Scandinavian military techniques and Frankish fortification principles, demonstrating practical adaptation rather than wholesale imitation. Economic integration further solidified early Norman governance. Settlers participated in local markets and riverine trade, exchanging agricultural produce, furs, and other commodities for coinage, tools, and luxury goods. Numismatic evidence, including hoards of Carolingian silver found in Normandy, indicates that Scandinavian settlers engaged with regional monetary systems. This participation reinforced ties to Frankish economic networks, providing resources to sustain both civil administration and military operations. The consolidation of authority under early dukes relied on both continuity and coercion. Military leaders maintained hierarchical structures familiar from Scandinavian bands, while simultaneously observing Frankish obligations to the crown and local communities. The combination of martial readiness and administrative assimilation allowed the Normans to exercise control over dispersed populations and secure strategic points along rivers and trade routes. Contemporary chronicles describe the enforcement of order through both personal loyalty and institutionalized office, demonstrating a hybrid approach to governance. Religious integration had political as well as spiritual significance. Monastic patronage served to legitimize Norman authority in the eyes of both settlers and indigenous populations. Clerical endorsement reinforced ducal claims to land and governance, and ecclesiastical structures functioned as record-keeping and judicial centers. The coordination between secular and religious authorities reflected an adaptation of Carolingian practices, ensuring that Norman rulers operated within recognized frameworks of legitimacy. Social integration accompanied political and religious measures. Intermarriage with local elites, the settlement of Scandinavian followers within existing villages, and the participation in regional assemblies fostered cohesion. Charters and annals note agreements with neighboring counts and bishops, formalizing obligations and alliances. These arrangements reinforced the perception of continuity rather than conquest, minimizing social disruption while consolidating ducal authority. Military organization continued to play a central role in governance. Norman leaders retained the capacity for rapid mobilization, drawing upon retainers loyal through personal ties and service obligations. Fortified centers, combined with riverine mobility, allowed control over both internal and external threats. Archaeological evidence of weapons, defensive structures, and temporary encampments supports textual accounts of a society capable of defending its territory while remaining adaptable in strategy and logistics. The combined effect of these measures was the emergence of a functional polity capable of sustaining both settlement and expansion. Integration of Frankish legal, linguistic, religious, and administrative structures allowed the Normans to exercise authority effectively while retaining elements of their Scandinavian heritage. This hybrid system provided stability in the Lower Seine region, facilitating trade, resource management, and the administration of justice. By the end of this early integration phase, Normandy had transitioned from a territory defined by seasonal raiding and ad hoc control to a coherent duchy with recognized leadership, legal frameworks, and institutional continuity. The Normans' capacity to absorb and adapt pre-existing systems rather than imposing radical change laid the foundation for subsequent territorial expansion, consolidation of ducal power, and the eventual projection of influence beyond northern Francia. Integration enabled expansion and consolidation under later dukes, establishing the administrative and social structures that would support Normandy's growth into a durable political entity. Normandy expanded not through chaos, but calculation. Following the early establishment of Norman governance along the Lower Seine, the duchy entered a phase of deliberate territorial growth under successive rulers, most notably William Longsword, c. 893 to 942, and his son Richard I, r. 942 to 996. Expansion relied on a combination of military campaigns, strategic alliances, and marital diplomacy. Documentary evidence, including surviving charters, royal grants, and ecclesiastical records, demonstrates the systematic integration of neighboring territories into Norman authority. These measures reflect a calculated approach to consolidating ducal power rather than ad hoc conquest. William Longsword inherited a territory defined by the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte and early integration measures, but the duchy remained surrounded by potentially hostile neighbors, including Bretons, Viking bands, and fractious Frankish counts. Contemporary annals, such as Flodord of Reims' Annals, describe William's campaigns along the Lower Seine and the Cotentin Peninsula, where military expeditions secured key fortifications and river crossings. Archaeological surveys reveal early Motte and Bailey fortifications at strategic locations, corresponding with chartered holdings, indicating the formal extension of ducal authority through both force and legal recognition. Military campaigns were complemented by diplomatic marriages and alliances. William Longsword's marriage to Lutgard of Vermandois, daughter of Herbert II, Count of Vermandois, exemplifies the use of dynastic connections to legitimize territorial claims and secure peace with neighboring elites. Subsequent agreements with regional counts allowed Normandy to extend influence without continuous conflict, reducing the risk of protracted military engagement. Surviving charters document land exchanges and oaths of fidelity, illustrating the fusion of martial and legal mechanisms in territorial expansion. Richard I continued this pattern of structured growth. He consolidated control over the Cotentin, Avranches, and adjacent river valleys, extending Norman influence across the western frontiers. Chroniclers, including Dudo of St. Quentin, describe campaigns to assert ducal authority against Breton resistance and neighboring Frankish lords, while modern historians cross-reference these narratives with charter evidence to reconstruct precise territorial acquisitions. Documents recording grants of land, construction of fortifications, and settlement organization provide concrete markers of expansion, confirming the systematic nature of Norman territorial strategy. The integration of newly acquired lands involved establishing ducal oversight and local administration. Normans installed loyal followers in key positions, maintaining continuity with existing structures while introducing Scandinavian martial organization. Archaeological evidence from fortification sites and rural settlements indicates that timber castles and defensive earthworks were constructed along rivers and roadways, facilitating rapid mobilization and assertion of authority. These fortifications also served as administrative centers, reinforcing legal control and resource collection. Church patronage played a complementary role in territorial integration. Ecclesiastical foundations within newly controlled lands, such as abbeys and parish churches, were often endowed by ducal decree. Surviving charters document these grants, linking spiritual authority to political control. Monastic centers provided record-keeping functions, judicial oversight, and local governance support, aligning religious and secular authority to facilitate smoother integration of populations previously outside Norman jurisdiction. Economic considerations informed the expansion strategy. Control over fertile river valleys, trade routes, and emerging urban centers increased revenue through taxation, tolls, and agricultural production. Coin hoards and numismatic evidence from the 10th century show the circulation of Carolingian and local silver currency, indicating active participation in regional commerce. The combination of economic incentive and military oversight strengthened ducal capacity to sustain further expansion and maintain stability in acquired territories. Conflict resolution and negotiation were integral to territorial consolidation. Where direct conquest was impractical or costly, Norman rulers relied on oaths of loyalty and fealty from local elites. These agreements were often formalized in charters and witnessed by ecclesiastical authorities, providing legal recognition that reinforced ducal claims. Such arrangements allowed Normandy to extend its influence without continuous warfare, reflecting a strategic preference for structured integration over unchecked aggression. The military organization supporting expansion was adapted to both internal and external challenges. Norman forces combined Scandinavian raiding experience with local recruitment, maintaining readiness for both border defense and offensive operations. Tactical deployment along rivers and control of strategic passes allowed effective surveillance and rapid response to threats. Archaeological findings, including weapon deposits and fortification remains, corroborate textual evidence of sustained military preparedness accompanying territorial growth. By the mid-10th century, Normandy had expanded into a coherent territorial entity with clearly defined boundaries, extending from the lower Seine to the Cotentin and inland river valleys. Control was formalized through charters, fortifications, and local administration, creating a durable framework for governance. Integration of newly acquired lands into this framework relied on a combination of military presence, diplomatic negotiation, and institutional assimilation. The interplay of strategic marriages, diplomatic agreements, and military campaigns illustrates the deliberate and calculated nature of Norman expansion. These mechanisms ensured continuity of authority, legal legitimacy, and administrative coherence, distinguishing the process from unstructured conquest. The resulting territorial growth established the physical and institutional foundation for future consolidation under later dukes, enabling Normandy to emerge as a significant power within northern Francia. Normandy's expansion during this period demonstrates how a combination of political acumen, military capability, and institutional adaptation could extend ducal authority effectively. Records indicate that newly acquired lands were quickly incorporated into legal, religious, and administrative systems, enabling rulers to exercise coherent governance. Archaeological evidence of fortifications, settlements, and ecclesiastical foundations confirms that expansion was accompanied by tangible infrastructure supporting both military control and civil administration. By the end of Richard I's reign, Normandy had achieved a level of territorial coherence and administrative integration that allowed subsequent rulers to focus on internal consolidation and external projection of power. The combination of strategic territorial acquisition, diplomatic negotiation, and institutional integration set the stage for the emergence of a centralized Norman state capable of sustained governance and expansion. Territorial growth demanded stronger internal control, leading Norman rulers to develop robust administrative structures, legal frameworks, and hierarchical governance to consolidate their authority across the duchy. Power in Normandy rested on land, loyalty, and stone. As Normandy expanded under the leadership of William Longsword and Richard I, the consolidation of ducal authority required the systematic organization of land, military service, and local governance. This organization took the form of early Norman feudal structures, a system balancing decentralized management with the maintenance of centralized ducal control. Evidence from charters, annals, and archaeological surveys demonstrates how the duchy integrated vassalage, fortifications, and legal oversight to maintain cohesion across a rapidly growing territory. Feudal relationships were established through the distribution of land to loyal followers, who in turn owed military service and allegiance to the duke. Charters record grants of fiefs to Norman knights and magnates, specifying obligations including defense, provision of armed retainers, and participation in ducal councils. This system allowed the duke to extend his authority across the duchy without direct administrative oversight of every locality. By creating hierarchies of landholding and obligation, Norman rulers ensured a dependable military and governance network while accommodating the autonomy of local lords. The construction of castles was integral to enforcing ducal authority. Archaeological evidence indicates the widespread adoption of motte and bailey fortifications from the mid-10th century onward. These structures, typically composed of timber, keeps atop raised earth mounds surrounded by protective baileys, served multiple functions: defensive strongholds, administrative centers, and symbols of ducal presence. Excavations at sites such as Château de Falaise and Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte confirm that these fortifications were strategically positioned along rivers, trade routes, and contested borders, enabling rapid military response and territorial oversight. Castles functioned as nodes of power within the feudal hierarchy. They housed garrisons, stored resources, and provided venues for adjudication and local governance. Documentary sources, including ducal charters and monastic accounts, frequently reference the use of castles as centers for oath-taking and enforcement of vassal obligations. By embedding both military and administrative functions within these structures, Norman rulers maintained control over dispersed territories while enabling subordinate lords to manage daily affairs locally. Vassalage reinforced political cohesion through formalized oaths of loyalty. Normans adopted a system in which lords pledged fidelity to their immediate overlord, ultimately linking back to the duke. These obligations included military service, attendance at ducal councils, and support in judicial matters. Surviving charters from the late 10th and early 11th centuries document explicit agreements specifying these duties, reflecting a structured approach to governance that combined obligation, hierarchy, and legal codification. The relationship between the duke and vassals balanced decentralization with centralized oversight. While local lords exercised considerable autonomy over their lands, the duke retained authority to adjudicate disputes, command military action, and regulate inheritance where necessary. Monastic chronicles, such as those from Jumiages and Saint Ouen, indicate that ducal intervention occurred primarily in cases of rebellion, succession disputes, or strategic importance. This flexibility allowed Normandy to accommodate the personal ambitions of powerful magnates while preserving overall ducal primacy. Land tenure was a critical instrument for structuring authority. Dukes granted estates based on loyalty and service, often reserving strategic locations for direct control. Charters demonstrate the codification of land rights, inheritance, and associated obligations, providing a legal framework that reinforced feudal bonds. By establishing clear property and service relationships, ducal authority was institutionalized across both newly acquired territories and long-standing settlements. Military organization was embedded within feudal structures. Knights and retainers mobilized from their holdings in response to ducal summons, ensuring that the duke could field forces proportionate to threats while maintaining regional stability. Archaeological evidence, including weapon caches and fortification networks, confirms that Norman military capacity was decentralized yet responsive, relying on a combination of fortified strongpoints and loyal vassal networks. The integration of ecclesiastical structures further strengthened feudal governance. Churches and monasteries acted as intermediaries between ducal authority and local communities, maintaining records, mediating disputes, and legitimizing land grants. Documentary evidence indicates that Norman dukes endowed religious institutions with estates, reinforcing loyalty and establishing moral authority alongside military and legal power. Monastic centers often served as venues for oath-taking, judicial arbitration, and coordination of feudal obligations, embedding spiritual authority into secular governance. Social cohesion was maintained through a combination of legal obligation, military service, and religious endorsement. Vassals were both empowered and constrained by their reciprocal relationship with the duke. Charters frequently reference witnesses from local elites and clergy, emphasizing that ducal decisions were reinforced through multiple layers of societal recognition. This system ensured both the enforcement of authority and the stability of social hierarchies across the duchy. The physical landscape of Normandy reflected the consolidation of ducal power. Fortified sites, rural estates, and ecclesiastical foundations created a network of controlled spaces enabling governance, defense, and economic oversight. Settlement patterns documented in charters and archaeological surveys show strategic placement of fortifications near rivers, crossroads, and borders, providing both visibility and accessibility for ducal intervention. Timber castles and fortified manors symbolized authority while facilitating practical administration and rapid military deployment. Norman rulers also codified dispute resolution mechanisms to manage internal tensions. Ducal courts, convened at central locations, arbitrated disagreements among vassals, monitored succession claims, and enforced obligations. These judicial procedures, documented in surviving charters and annals, reflect a systematic approach to governance combining local autonomy with overarching ducal oversight. This structure reinforced political cohesion, minimized conflict, and ensured continuity of authority across generations. Economic administration complemented feudal organization. Control over land, tolls, and trade routes allowed the duke to extract revenue for military and administrative purposes. Evidence from charters indicates regulation of agricultural production, taxation, and resource allocation, providing a stable foundation for the functioning of feudal obligations. The integration of economic oversight within the feudal hierarchy enabled long-term sustainability and facilitated the expansion of Norman influence. By the early 11th century, Normandy had developed a feudal framework capable of supporting both territorial control and internal cohesion. The combination of land-based authority, vassal loyalty, castle fortifications, ecclesiastical partnership, and administrative oversight created a resilient system balancing decentralized management with centralized power. The duchy could thus maintain stability, respond effectively to threats, and prepare for future succession and expansion. The establishment of these structures laid the groundwork for subsequent political challenges. Succession crises, internal disputes, and external pressures would test the durability of feudal authority, requiring adaptability and enforcement. Nevertheless, the integration of land, loyalty, and stone provided a durable foundation for ducal governance, ensuring that Normandy could function as a cohesive political entity across a landscape of dispersed settlements and diverse populations. These systems would be tested by succession crises, forcing Norman rulers to navigate inheritance disputes, internal challenges, and the consolidation of power across generations. By force of arms, William secured his future. After over a decade of political fragmentation during William's minority, the young duke faced the challenge of asserting authority over a duchy fractured by rebellious nobles. The culmination of this effort occurred in 1047 at the Battle of Valley-Estunes, near Caen, where William, with the support of King Henry I of France, confronted a coalition of insurgent Norman barons. Contemporary chroniclers, including William of Jumiages and Ord-Eric Vitalis, described the engagement as decisive for consolidating ducal power and establishing William's legitimacy as ruler of Normandy. The context of the battle reflects the volatility of mid-11th century Normandy. Following the minority, leading magnates had strengthened local positions, constructed private fortifications, and formed semi-independent armed coalitions. Archaeological evidence indicates numerous motte and bailey castles in the region, many of which had been constructed or reinforced during periods of civil unrest. These sites allowed rebellious nobles to project force locally, presenting a persistent threat to centralized ducal authority. The Valley-Estunes campaign was therefore not merely a military encounter, but a strategic operation to reassert control over the duchy. William's alliance with King Henry I of France was critical. Henry's support provided both military reinforcements and political legitimacy, framing the confrontation as not only a ducal assertion of power, but also a demonstration of feudal hierarchy under royal oversight. Charters and chronicles document the coordination of forces, indicating that William's army included both Norman loyalists and contingents provided by the French crown. This collaboration highlights the interdependence of regional and royal authority in maintaining stability within feudal Europe. The battle itself involved the engagement of heavily armed cavalry and infantry drawn from both ducal retainers and allied forces. Contemporary sources detail the routing of rebel factions and the capture of key insurgent leaders, illustrating the effectiveness of coordinated military strategy. Archaeological evidence from the region, including remnants of weaponry and temporary fortifications, supports the textual accounts of concentrated military activity and the strategic use of terrain to neutralize fortified positions. Victory at Valley-Estunes enabled William to impose ducal authority decisively. Rebellious nobles who had previously acted with near autonomy were compelled to submit to ducal oversight, swear renewed oaths of loyalty, and accept the enforcement of feudal obligations. Charters issued in the years following the battle formalized these arrangements, documenting the restoration of ducal rights over previously contested territories. This legal codification reinforced the military outcome, ensuring that authority was maintained not only through force but also through recognized institutional mechanisms. The consolidation of authority extended to administrative structures across Normandy. Fortifications previously controlled by insurgent magnates were either neutralized, garrisoned by loyalists, or incorporated into ducal oversight networks. This restructuring reinforced the spatial and organizational reach of the duke, enabling systematic management of taxation, justice, and resource allocation. Archaeological surveys indicate modifications to several motte and bailey sites, consistent with efforts to centralize control and prevent future insurrections. Military and political lessons from Valley-Estunes shaped subsequent Norman governance. The engagement demonstrated the necessity of combined arms coordination, disciplined retainers, and strategic alliances in maintaining ducal authority. It also highlighted the importance of balancing coercion with legal recognition, ensuring that subordinate lords remained integrated within the feudal framework. Contemporary chronicles emphasize William's strategic acumen, noting both the calculated use of royal support and the organization of loyalist forces to achieve durable outcomes. The battle's outcome also reinforced William's personal legitimacy. Prior to Valley-Estunes, his status as an illegitimate heir had been a point of contention among nobles and neighboring rulers. By successfully commanding forces and restoring order, William transformed perception of his ducal authority, establishing both recognition and deterrence. Documents from the period indicate increased stability in land tenure, clearer enforcement of oaths, and reduced noble insubordination, demonstrating the practical consequences of military success on governance. Economic stabilization followed military consolidation. With rebellion curtailed, trade routes, agricultural production, and toll collection resumed under ducal supervision. Charters and fiscal records suggest that revenue streams previously disrupted by conflict were restored, providing resources necessary for ongoing administration, military preparedness, and ecclesiastical patronage. This reestablishment of economic order reinforced the social and political legitimacy of William's rule. Religious institutions again played a stabilizing role. Monasteries and abbeys acted as intermediaries, documenting the submission of rebellious lords, witnessing oaths of loyalty, and mediating disputes arising from post-battle settlement. Ecclesiastical involvement ensured that legal and social continuity was maintained, while reinforcing the moral authority of ducal actions. Churches continued to serve as administrative nodes, recording property rights and obligations that underpinned feudal governance. By 1047, Normandy had transitioned from a fragmented, militarized duchy to a more cohesive political entity. William's victory at Valley-les-Dunes marked the culmination of strategies combining military force, alliance building, administrative oversight, and legal codification. The reassertion of ducal authority created a stable framework for subsequent territorial expansion and institutional consolidation, setting the stage for Normandy's emergence as a major power in northern France. The significance of Valley-les-Dunes extends beyond immediate military outcomes. The battle illustrates the interplay between personal leadership, feudal obligation, and institutional resilience in medieval Europe. By securing loyalty, restoring legal order, and integrating previously autonomous nobles, William established the functional and symbolic foundations of ducal authority. Archaeological evidence of fortified sites and textual records of oaths and charters together demonstrate the multifaceted strategies employed to stabilize Normandy. The lessons of this period influenced subsequent governance, particularly in the development of feudal hierarchy, military organization, and strategic alliances. William's experience emphasized that the exercise of ducal power depended not solely on military capacity, but on the integration of legal, social, and ecclesiastical mechanisms to sustain authority across a complex and decentralized territory. This period established a model for future ducal administration, combining coercion, negotiation, and institutional structures to maintain political cohesion. With authority restored, Normandy entered a period of expansion, enabling the duchy to consolidate its institutions, extend territorial influence, and project power beyond the Seine. Norman power rested not on ethnicity, but on an unusually disciplined aristocracy. By the early 11th century, Normandy had developed a socially and politically stratified system that underpinned the duchy's capacity for governance, military mobilization, and territorial expansion. Central to this system was a cohesive aristocratic elite, organized around kinship networks, hereditary lordship, and castle-centered authority. Contemporary chronicles, particularly William of Jumièges Gesta Normanorum Ducum, alongside surviving ducal charters, provide detailed evidence of how Norman elites maintained social order, enforced obligations, and balanced local autonomy with loyalty to the duke. The aristocracy functioned as both the administrative and military backbone of Normandy. Large landholders, often referred to as barons or counts, exercised authority over multiple estates and fortifications. Their control encompassed judicial rights, fiscal responsibilities, and military leadership within their respective territories. Charters document grants of land by the duke to key figures, specifying obligations such as provision of armed retainers, attendance at ducal councils, and enforcement of justice among tenants. These reciprocal arrangements reinforced ducal authority while allowing magnates to maintain a measure of autonomy over local affairs. Kinship and hereditary succession were central to aristocratic cohesion. Noble lineages established claims to land, offices, and titles across generations, fostering political continuity and predictable alliances. Marital connections between leading families strengthened networks of loyalty and obligation, creating durable bonds among the upper echelons of Norman society. Historical evidence demonstrates that such alliances were not purely social. They were often codified in charters detailing property transfers, dower arrangements, and military responsibilities, providing both legal and practical frameworks for aristocratic cohesion. Castle-based authority defined the spatial and organizational structure of the aristocracy. Motte and bailey fortifications, often positioned at strategic river crossings or high ground, served as administrative centers, residences, and military strongpoints. Archaeological surveys at sites such as Falaise, Bayeux, and can reveal patterns of defensive architecture consistent with localized enforcement of ducal policies. Castles enabled aristocrats to exercise control over surrounding populations, collect dues, administer justice, and muster troops, linking territorial management directly to military capacity. The relationship between lord and vassal formed the operational core of Norman feudal society. Vassals owed military service, loyalty, and support to their lord, who in turn provided protection, land rights, and legal recognition. Charters from the period frequently detail the obligations of vassals, including service in ducal campaigns, fortification construction, and attendance at courts. This system of reciprocal obligation extended the reach of ducal authority through a network of semi-autonomous intermediaries while ensuring coordinated military and administrative action. Norman social hierarchy extended beyond the aristocracy to include lesser freeholders and dependent peasants. While their rights were more constrained and obligations more burdensome, these groups were integrated into the economic and judicial systems maintained by the elite. Agricultural labor, rent payments, and military support obligations provided the resources necessary for sustaining both local governance and ducal projects. Archaeological and charter evidence shows that lords regulated land usage, managed village organization, and adjudicated disputes, reflecting a socially stratified yet functionally integrated society. Justice and legal authority were closely tied to landholding. Lords exercised local jurisdiction over tenants and dependents, resolving disputes, enforcing fines, and maintaining order. Ecclesiastical authorities often acted as intermediaries, recording agreements, witnessing transactions, and legitimizing judicial decisions. Charters document a dual system in which secular lords maintained control over daily administration while ecclesiastical institutions provided legitimacy and record-keeping functions. This partnership reinforced both local authority and overarching ducal power. Economic control reinforced social and political hierarchy. Aristocrats collected rents, tolls, and agricultural produce, which supported both local administration and military obligations. Surviving fiscal records and charter evidence indicate that revenues were carefully managed and distributed, often including contributions to the ducal treasury or ecclesiastical institutions. This system ensured that the aristocracy possessed both the resources and the incentive to maintain loyalty to the duke, linking economic capacity directly to political stability. Military preparedness was embedded in social structure. Nobles maintained armed retainers and garrisons, with service obligations formalized through oaths and charters. Fortifications, combined with structured vassalage, allowed the duchy to mobilize significant forces rapidly in response to internal rebellion or external threat. Archaeological evidence of weapons caches, fortified sites, and settlement layouts corroborates textual sources indicating a society organized around both martial readiness and administrative hierarchy. The aristocracy's relationship with the duke reflected a balance between autonomy and centralized authority. While powerful magnates exercised considerable discretion over local affairs, they were bound by formal obligations to the ducal household, including military support, attendance at councils, and recognition of ducal legal supremacy. Charters and chronicles document occasions in which the duke mediated disputes, enforced oaths, or intervened directly in landholding matters, demonstrating the dynamic interplay between decentralized power and centralized oversight. Cultural and symbolic aspects reinforced social hierarchy. Ritualized ceremonies of homage, oath-taking, and fealty strengthened bonds between lords, vassals, and the duke, creating a shared framework of legitimacy. Ecclesiastical endorsement further enhanced the perceived moral authority of aristocratic actions, integrating religious and political hierarchies. Churches and monastic institutions acted as both spiritual centers and administrative hubs, witnessing transactions, recording obligations, and mediating conflicts. Norman elites also engaged in wider networks of diplomacy and marriage beyond the duchy. Alliances with neighboring territories, including Brittany and Flanders, were formalized through matrimonial arrangements, demonstrating the integration of social hierarchy with strategic planning. These connections extended ducal influence, provided opportunities for military collaboration, and reinforced the prestige of Norman aristocracy across northern France. By consolidating landholding, military service, and administrative authority within a clearly defined aristocratic hierarchy, Normandy established a socially disciplined framework capable of sustaining ducal power and projecting influence. The combination of hereditary succession, vassal obligations, castle-centered governance, and economic management ensured that the duchy could coordinate military action, enforce justice, and maintain internal stability across dispersed and diverse populations. The effectiveness of Norman aristocracy lay not merely in the loyalty of individual lords, but in the structured networks of obligation, property, and military service that bound society together. Charters, ecclesiastical records, and archaeological evidence collectively illustrate a society in which authority, resources, and obligations were codified, enabling long-term coordination and resilience. This framework allowed the Normans to respond effectively to both internal challenges and opportunities for territorial expansion. By the mid-11th century, this aristocratic and hierarchical structure provided the institutional foundation for the political, military, and economic successes that would define Normandy in the decades preceding the conquest of England. Social discipline, legal codification, and integration with ecclesiastical structures created a society capable of rapid mobilization, strategic governance, and coordinated action under ducal leadership. Elite authority was reinforced and legitimized through close cooperation with the Church, which provided spiritual sanction, administrative support, and mediation necessary for sustaining social and political cohesion across Normandy. Norman rulers strengthened their power by reforming the Church, not controlling it. By the early 11th century, Normandy had emerged as a significant center of ecclesiastical reform, aligning its religious institutions with the broader movements of the Latin Church. The duchy's rulers engaged in active patronage of monasteries, episcopal organization, and clerical reform, thereby reinforcing ducal authority while integrating Normandy into the networks of European Christendom. Contemporary charters, monastic cartularies, and archaeological evidence of church foundations provide a detailed record of how religious reform and political governance were mutually reinforcing. Key centers of monastic life, such as Fécamp, Jumièges, and Saint-Ouen in Rouen, illustrate the dual religious and administrative functions of Norman ecclesiastical institutions. Monasteries were endowed with lands, privileges, and resources by ducal decree, enabling them to operate as hubs of religious observance, education, and record-keeping. Archaeological surveys of these sites reveal complex layouts with churches, cloisters, and auxiliary structures, confirming that monastic establishments were both spiritual centers and practical instruments of governance. Ducal patronage was a strategic tool for consolidating authority. By supporting monastic reform and founding new religious houses, Norman rulers gained legitimacy, strengthened loyalty among ecclesiastical elites, and extended administrative influence into local communities. Charters documenting grants to monasteries often stipulated obligations such as prayers for the ruling family, provision of hospitality, and the management of surrounding lands. These agreements codified reciprocal relationships, integrating religious institutions into the social and political framework of the duchy. Norman monasteries actively participated in broader European reform movements. From the early 11th century, Fécamp and Jumièges adopted practices inspired by Cluniac ideals, emphasizing liturgical discipline, adherence to the rule of Saint Benedict, and the autonomy of monastic governance. Surviving manuscripts and charter evidence document the arrival of reforming abbots and clerics from other regions, indicating deliberate engagement with continental ecclesiastical networks. This participation positioned Normandy as both a beneficiary and contributor to transregional church reforms. Episcopal organization in Normandy was similarly enhanced through ducal support. Bishops received formal recognition, territorial endowments, and responsibilities for overseeing diocesan discipline. Charters confirmed that Norman dukes maintained a balance between respecting episcopal autonomy and ensuring that ecclesiastical authorities supported ducal governance. Bishops often mediated disputes, confirmed land transactions, and participated in councils convened by the duke, linking religious authority directly to political administration. Monastic foundations also functioned as economic and cultural centers. Estates attached to monasteries generated agricultural produce, provided employment, and collected rents, contributing to both local prosperity and ducal revenues. Archaeological evidence, including storage facilities, mills, and workshops, demonstrates that monastic institutions managed complex economic networks. Scriptoria within monasteries preserved documents, copied texts, and recorded charters, further integrating Normandy into broader intellectual and administrative networks of the Latin West. Reform initiatives strengthened social cohesion and the moral authority of the ducal administration. By promoting clerical discipline, standardizing liturgical practice, and endorsing ecclesiastical hierarchy, Norman rulers legitimized their governance through alignment with the universal church. Contemporary chroniclers, including William of Jumiages, emphasized that the duke's relationship with monasteries was characterized by support rather than coercion, reflecting an understanding that ecclesiastical independence enhanced both spiritual and political stability. The interplay between monastic reform and territorial administration is evident in the spatial distribution of monasteries and churches. Founding charters frequently allocated land strategically, placing religious institutions at crossroads, river valleys, or contested border areas. These placements allowed monasteries to serve as centers of ducal influence, providing oversight, dispute resolution, and administrative coordination in regions distant from the ducal court. Archaeological evidence of fortified or enclosed monastic precincts indicates a dual role in religious observance and territorial security. Norman engagement with the papacy and continental reformers further reinforced political legitimacy. Diplomatic correspondence and recorded visits by reforming clerics, including those associated with Cluny, demonstrate that Normandy was both aware of and responsive to developments in European ecclesiastical policy. These connections enhanced the duchy's prestige, facilitated cultural and intellectual exchange, and embedded Normandy within the broader network of Latin Christendom, extending influence beyond purely local or regional concerns. Monastic patronage also contributed to literacy, record-keeping, and legal continuity. Scriptoria within fee camp, jumiages, and other centers preserved charters, genealogies, and administrative records essential for governing the duchy. This documentation enabled systematic enforcement of property rights, feudal obligations, and ducal directives, creating a continuity of governance that outlasted individual rulers. Archaeological evidence of book production, storage, and libraries corroborates textual references, underscoring the practical importance of monasteries for both spiritual and administrative functions. Religious reform facilitated the integration of Norman elites into a shared ideological framework. Nobles participating in monastic endowments or episcopal oversight reinforced their own social and political standing while demonstrating alignment with church authority. Charters documenting donations, land grants, and ecclesiastical privileges highlight the reciprocal relationship between aristocracy and clergy. This synergy ensured that ducal, noble, and ecclesiastical interests were mutually reinforcing, enhancing the stability of both governance and society. The effectiveness of church reform in consolidating ducal power is evident in the long-term stability of Normandy. By supporting monasteries and bishops while respecting ecclesiastical autonomy, dukes created a system in which spiritual authority complemented political authority. Monastic networks facilitated communication, maintained records, and mediated disputes, integrating diverse regions into a coherent administrative and moral framework. Normandy thus became a model of how religious reform could strengthen secular power without undermining ecclesiastical independence. By the mid-11th century, Norman monasticism and episcopal structures had established a durable institutional network supporting both spiritual and temporal governance. Reform initiatives enhanced the prestige of the duchy, strengthened aristocratic loyalty, and promoted economic and administrative efficiency. Archaeological and textual evidence together demonstrate that religious institutions were central to Normandy's social, economic, and political life, providing stability and cohesion essential for subsequent expansion and military endeavors. Religious stability supported economic growth and administrative coherence, laying the groundwork for the duchy's enhanced capacity for trade, agricultural production, and coordinated governance in the decades leading to 1066 IN 1066. England's throne was legally vacant and politically contested. The death of Edward the Confessor in January 1066 precipitated a constitutional and dynastic crisis that would culminate in one of the most consequential conflicts of medieval Europe. Edward left no direct heir, creating a political vacuum in a kingdom structured around a combination of kinship claims, elective principles, and feudal obligations. Contemporary sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, William of Jumiages Gesta Normanorum Ducum, and later legal codices, indicate that multiple claimants interpreted succession norms to support their ambitions, reflecting both customary practice and the fluidity of legitimacy in 11th century England. The principal contenders were Harold Godwin's son, the powerful Earl of Wessex, William, Duke of Normandy, and Harold Hardrada, King of Norway. Each based claims on overlapping legal, dynastic, and oath-based arguments. Harold Godwinson's candidacy relied on a combination of English royal precedent and his position as the dominant earl in England. He was recognized by the Witenagemot, the Council of Nobles and Clergy, as successor, demonstrating adherence to elective principles that had previously influenced English succession. His accession emphasized structural continuity within England's existing political institutions. William of Normandy's claim rested on both familial connection and prior oaths. According to Norman sources, Edward had promised William the throne during visits to Normandy, and Harold himself allegedly swore to support this succession. The Gesta Normanorum Ducum recounts that Harold's oath, taken under duress or in a sacred context, constituted binding consent to Norman claims. Diplomatic correspondence and charters from Normandy suggest that William leveraged these assertions to construct a legal and moral rationale for invasion, highlighting the intersection of personal oath, dynastic claim, and political ambition in 11th century succession disputes. Harold Hardrada's claim derived from the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte and historical agreements between Norway and England, as well as kinship ties through previous Danish rule. His invasion strategy reflected both a legal argument and military opportunity, as northern England maintained historical connections to Scandinavian rulers through conquest and dynastic precedent. Contemporary Anglo-Saxon and Norse sources, including Heimskringla, detail the logistical preparation and diplomatic negotiation preceding Hardrada's campaign, situating the Norwegian effort within a structured understanding of legitimate claims based on precedent and kinship. The succession crisis was amplified by regional factionalism and the decentralization of political authority. England's governance relied on a system of powerful earls and local magnates, each controlling extensive military and administrative resources. The Witenagemot's recognition of Harold Godwin's son did not guarantee universal support. Significant regional actors could choose loyalty based on personal alliances, land rights, or military calculation. Charters and annals from 1065 to 1066 indicate localized disputes and negotiations, demonstrating that structural instability rather than simple dynastic logic shaped the crisis. Legal norms governing succession were complex and partially overlapping. Customary elective practices coexisted with hereditary expectations, while oaths, promises, and ecclesiastical sanction all contributed to legitimacy. The ambiguity in Edward's intentions allowed competing interpretations to flourish. Ecclesiastical figures, including bishops and abbots, played both advisory and legitimizing roles, witnessing agreements, swearing oaths, and providing counsel to secular magnates. This integration of church authority into political decision-making illustrates the interplay between religious sanction and secular legitimacy. Diplomatic maneuvering was central to the contest. William's envoys sought to secure recognition from continental rulers, while Harold consolidated domestic support through negotiation with key earls and church authorities. Harold Hardrada coordinated with Tostig Godwin's son, Harold's estranged brother, reflecting the strategic use of familial and political alliances to bolster claims. These maneuvers illustrate that succession disputes were not resolved solely by inheritance law but involved continuous negotiation, alliance building, and strategic positioning. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle emphasizes that Harold's coronation was both rapid and politically necessary, as it sought to preempt external claims and internal fragmentation. Recognition by the Witenagemot provided legal cover for military mobilization, including the assembly of FYRD units and preparation for potential invasions. Chronicles detail the mustering of forces in southern England and the logistical arrangements for defense, indicating that military readiness was integral to the enforcement of dynastic legitimacy. Norman sources frame the crisis as a matter of breached oath and dynastic obligation. William's claim was constructed around Harold's alleged violation of a sacred promise, thereby creating a moral as well as legal pretext for military intervention. Charters and letters from Normandy detail preparations for an invasion, including the assembly of fleets, recruitment of knights, and coordination of continental allies. These preparations underscore the systematic approach to asserting claims through force when legal and diplomatic avenues were deemed insufficient. The overlapping claims demonstrate the structural instability inherent in succession disputes of the period. England's combination of elective principles, hereditary expectation, and decentralized authority created multiple, plausible interpretations of legitimacy. Contemporary records indicate that each claimant actively sought to exploit ambiguities, demonstrating that succession crises were contingent on negotiation, alliance, and military capability as much as on legal or dynastic precedent. Economic and administrative considerations also influenced the crisis. The collection of taxes, control of key towns and ports, and management of military resources were essential for enforcing claims. Charters document the granting of rights, tolls, and revenues to secure loyalty and fund military operations. This integration of economic control with legal and dynastic claims highlights the multidimensional nature of legitimacy in 11th century England. Ultimately, the succession crisis escalated into military confrontation not through inevitability but through the interaction of competing claims, structural instability, and strategic decision-making. The mobilization of forces, timing of invasions, and coordination of allies transformed legal and dynastic ambiguity into open warfare. Sources from both England and Normandy emphasize that the resolution of the crisis depended on the decisive application of military power in conjunction with prior claims, oaths, and political alliances. The structural dynamics of 1066 illustrate the interdependence of political, legal, and military authority. England's elective practices, combined with dynastic inheritance norms and decentralized governance, created multiple centers of power, each capable of challenging or supporting a claimant. Oaths, treaties, and ecclesiastical recognition functioned as instruments of legitimacy, yet could be interpreted flexibly according to political and military opportunity. The succession crisis demonstrates that legitimacy was not static. It was constructed through action, recognition, and enforcement. By mid-1066, the succession dispute had crystallized into a triad of claimants with overlapping and conflicting justifications. Harold Godwin's son, recognized domestically, prepared defenses against Norwegian invasion. William of Normandy, asserting oaths and familial claims, prepared for continental deployment. Harold Hardrada, relying on historical precedent and Scandinavian connections, launched a northern campaign. These simultaneous pressures exemplify the complexity of medieval succession crises and the structural vulnerabilities of kingdoms dependent on personal and regional loyalties. Rival claims quickly escalated into military confrontation, setting the stage for a sequence of battles that would determine the political future of England and introduce Norman governance to the Anglo-Saxon realm. Hastings was not a miracle, it was a calculated military victory. Following the succession crisis of 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, mobilized a disciplined and well-structured army to enforce his claim to the English throne. Contemporary sources, including William of Jumièges, Orderic Vitalis, and the Bayeux Tapestry, provide evidence for the organization, strategy, and execution of the Norman campaign. Analysis of these sources, combined with archaeological and topographical studies, demonstrates that the Battle of Hastings was a deliberate, meticulously planned engagement, reflecting the logistical sophistication and military doctrine of mid-11th century Normandy. The Norman army consisted of a combination of infantry, cavalry, and archers, organized into a hierarchical command structure with clear lines of authority. Troop composition was influenced by feudal obligations, with knights providing mounted service in exchange for land or privileges, while infantry contingents and archers were raised from both ducal retainers and allied contingents from surrounding territories. Chronicles indicate that the army numbered approximately 7,000 to 8,000 men, though estimates vary, emphasizing the need to interpret sources critically. Logistical preparation for the campaign was extensive. William assembled fleets capable of transporting both men and horses across the English Channel, a significant undertaking given the maritime technology and weather conditions of the period. Contemporary accounts suggest that embarkation required precise coordination, with ships organized to maintain cohesion of forces and ensure rapid disembarkation upon landing. Archaeological and topographical studies of southern English ports, including Pevensey, provide context for the scale and complexity of the amphibious operation. Upon landing in Sussex, Norman forces faced the challenge of confronting Harold Godwinson's army, which had recently repelled Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. The English army, composed primarily of housecarls and FYRD levies, was arranged in a defensive shield wall along elevated terrain near Hastings. This formation, documented in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and represented iconographically in the Bayeux Tapestry, relied on the cohesion of infantry ranks and the defensive advantage of position. The tactical choice to hold the high ground reflected the conventional defensive strategies of Anglo-Saxon warfare. The battle unfolded over a single day, characterized by iterative assaults, tactical feints, and disciplined command. Norman archers initiated attacks on the shield wall, weakening the cohesion of English infantry. Cavalry charges, coordinated with infantry support, exploited gaps created by feigned retreats, a maneuver emphasized in both the tapestry and textual sources. Contemporary descriptions indicate that these tactics, rather than brute force alone, were decisive in breaking English resistance. The integration of combined arms, archers, infantry, and cavalry demonstrates advanced Norman battlefield doctrine. Command structure and ducal leadership were critical to the Norman victory. William maintained direct oversight of battlefield maneuvers, coordinating attacks, monitoring enemy responses, and adapting tactics in real time. Chroniclers note that he led from a central position, using mounted mobility to communicate orders across units. The strategic employment of reserves, feigned withdrawals, and focused cavalry charges reflects a level of professional military planning uncommon for the period and underscores William's capacity for operational control. The death of Harold Godwinson, reportedly struck by an arrow to the eye as depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry, marked the decisive turning point of the battle. While iconography must be interpreted cautiously, corroboration from multiple textual sources indicates that Harold's death destabilized English command and morale, enabling the Norman army to achieve final victory. The collapse of the shield wall allowed Norman forces to systematically dismantle remaining resistance and secure the battlefield. Following the battle, William moved quickly to consolidate power. His coronation at Westminster Abbey in December 1066 formalized ducal authority over England. Surviving charters and ecclesiastical records indicate that William undertook immediate measures to assert governance, including confirming land grants, appointing loyal administrators, and establishing a network of fortifications to secure strategic locations. These actions demonstrate that military victory alone was insufficient. Political and administrative consolidation was essential for durable rule. The aftermath of Hastings highlights the importance of integrating military success with governance. William's use of loyal Norman nobles in key positions, combined with strategic marriages and church patronage, facilitated the extension of ducal authority across England. Domesday-era records indicate the systematic replacement of Anglo-Saxon elites with Norman counterparts, providing both political control and economic resource management necessary for sustaining the conquest. Economic and logistical considerations influenced post-battle stabilization. Control of major towns, ports, and road networks allowed William to secure supply lines, collect taxes, and maintain garrisons. Archaeological evidence from early Norman castles, such as those at Hastings, Dover, and Pevensey, demonstrates rapid construction consistent with strategic military occupation. These fortifications served both defensive and administrative purposes, reinforcing ducal authority in newly conquered territories. Ecclesiastical support was integral to consolidating Norman rule. William maintained alliances with bishops and abbots, confirming grants, endorsing monastic privileges, and leveraging church networks to legitimize authority. Contemporary records show that religious institutions facilitated governance by witnessing oaths, maintaining administrative records, and mediating disputes. The cooperation of ecclesiastical authorities strengthened both moral and practical legitimacy for the new regime. The Battle of Hastings and its immediate aftermath exemplify the interplay between tactical proficiency, logistical planning, and political strategy. Norman victory was not the result of chance. It reflected careful preparation, sophisticated military doctrine, and effective coordination of multi-layered forces. The integration of infantry, cavalry, and archers, combined with adaptive leadership and exploitation of battlefield conditions, demonstrates that Hastings was a calculated operation rather than a fortuitous triumph. Strategically, the victory at Hastings set the framework for subsequent military and administrative campaigns across England. Norman forces systematically advanced to secure key towns, castles, and river crossings, consolidating territorial control and neutralizing potential sources of resistance. Charters and land grants indicate that these measures were accompanied by legal and administrative integration, aligning English governance with Norman political structures. The conquest also illustrates broader structural dynamics of medieval warfare and state-building. Success depended on the capacity to mobilize resources, coordinate diverse forces, and integrate military outcomes with administrative frameworks. Norman experience in Normandy, including feudal organization, castle-based authority, and ecclesiastical partnerships, provided a template for effective governance that could be replicated in the newly acquired English territories. By the end of 1066, William had achieved both military and political objectives. The combination of tactical innovation, disciplined forces, and administrative foresight allowed the Normans to secure a kingdom structurally prepared for integration into their ducal system. Hastings exemplifies the synthesis of strategic military planning, feudal organization, and early statecraft, demonstrating how conquest and governance were inseparably linked in 11th century Europe. Victory created authority, but rule required administration, laying the foundation for systematic Norman governance, castle construction, and integration of England into ducal political and ecclesiastical networks. The Norman conquest continued long after Hastings. William I's victory at Hastings in 1066 marked the beginning of military control over England, but the establishment of durable governance required a sustained program of territorial consolidation. The early years of Norman rule were characterized by systematic castle construction, strategic redistribution of land, and suppression of recurrent rebellions. These measures, documented in charters, chronicles, and supported by archaeological surveys, demonstrate how the Normans transformed England's political and administrative structures to align with ducal and feudal principles. Castle building was central to Norman authority. Motte and Bailey fortifications were constructed rapidly across strategic locations, including river crossings, trade routes, and rebellious regions. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Hastings, Durham, and the Tower of London reveals standardized designs optimized for both defense and administrative control. These castles allowed Norman lords to project power locally, serve as garrisons for military forces, and act as centers for collecting taxes and administering justice. The density and distribution of castles illustrate a deliberate strategy to enforce territorial dominance over a previously decentralized kingdom. The redistribution of land reinforced Norman control by replacing Anglo-Saxon elites with loyal Norman tenants-in-chief. Charters and doomsday records indicate that significant estates were granted to William's supporters, often those who had participated in the invasion, thereby ensuring both military loyalty and administrative reliability. This process of land transfer was not only a reward mechanism, but also a means to integrate governance with feudal obligations, creating networks of vassalage that linked local authority directly to the crown. Rebellions between 1067 and 1075 highlight the challenges of consolidating power in a recently conquered territory. The resistance of northern and western regions, including Yorkshire and the Welsh borderlands, required coordinated military campaigns and administrative intervention. Chronicles, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Ord Eric Vitalis, document repeated uprisings, the strategic use of punitive measures, and the reconstruction of governance structures following suppression. These campaigns illustrate the interplay between coercion and institution building in securing long-term authority. Castles played a dual role in rebellion suppression and administrative integration. Fortifications functioned as bases for rapid military deployment, enabling the Normans to respond to insurgencies effectively. Simultaneously, castles served as local seats of government, facilitating the collection of rents, oversight of legal disputes, and enforcement of feudal obligations. Archaeological surveys of Motte and Bailey sites reveal evidence of palisades, ditches, and associated settlement structures, indicating that castles were integrated into broader social and economic landscapes, rather than isolated military posts. Norman governance extended beyond military control to include systematic administration. The introduction of sheriffs, drawn from loyal Norman circles, allowed the crown to enforce law, collect taxes, and oversee judicial matters across counties. Charters record the responsibilities and rights of sheriffs, illustrating a structured approach to governance that centralized authority while maintaining operational links to local communities. These officials ensured that feudal obligations, military conscription, and fiscal policies were effectively implemented, consolidating Norman influence throughout the kingdom. The suppression of rebellion required both direct military engagement and strategic accommodation. In some regions, the Normans negotiated local surrender in exchange for loyalty, while in others, punitive measures included destruction of settlements and imposition of heavy fines. The Harrying of the North, 1069 to 1070, exemplifies a calculated combination of military coercion, economic disruption, and administrative restructuring to eliminate persistent resistance. Contemporary chronicles and archaeological data provide evidence of widespread devastation, but also the subsequent establishment of Norman governance structures to stabilize the region. Integration of the English Church was a key component of administrative control. William appointed Norman bishops and abbots, confirming privileges and lands while replacing dissenting Anglo-Saxon clergy. Ecclesiastical reform reinforced loyalty, provided moral legitimacy for ducal authority, and facilitated record-keeping essential for governance. Monasteries and cathedral chapters functioned as both spiritual and administrative centers, recording land tenure, collecting rents, and mediating disputes, further embedding Norman authority across localities. Economic management was closely linked to territorial control. Doomsday surveys indicate systematic accounting of resources, including arable land, livestock, mills, and taxable populations. Castles and administrative centers served as focal points for resource extraction and redistribution, ensuring that ducal authority was supported by economic capacity. This integration of military, administrative, and fiscal control allowed the Normans to consolidate power despite the complex social and political landscape of post-conquest England. The network of castles also facilitated communication and coordination. Positioned to maintain visual contact or rapid communication across regions, castles allowed Norman commanders to transmit orders, mobilize troops, and monitor potential threats. Archaeological and topographical studies of castle locations indicate deliberate placement to maximize strategic oversight of territories, trade routes, and rebellious zones. The combination of physical presence, garrisoned forces, and administrative function ensured that ducal authority extended effectively into previously autonomous regions. Feudal obligations structured both loyalty and social hierarchy. Norman lords, tenants-in-chief, and subtenants were bound by oaths of service, military support, and fiscal duties. Charters detail specific obligations, including attendance at ducal courts, provision of knights, and contributions to infrastructure maintenance. This feudal framework enabled centralized coordination while accommodating local autonomy, providing a mechanism for long-term stability and integration across England. The effectiveness of Norman governance relied on a balance between coercion, loyalty, and institutionalization. Military action suppressed immediate threats, but administrative structures, legal codification, and ecclesiastical collaboration ensured sustainable control. Charters, fiscal records, and contemporary chronicles collectively demonstrate that authority was enforced systematically rather than through isolated displays of force. This approach allowed William and his successors to establish enduring structures of power. By 1080, Normandy's integration of military, administrative, and ecclesiastical systems had transformed England from a fragmented, rebellion-prone kingdom into a centralized realm capable of sustaining ducal authority. Castles, land redistribution, and suppression of insurgencies were complemented by legal, fiscal, and religious networks that reinforced political stability. Archaeological evidence of fortifications and settlement patterns, combined with documentary sources, provides a comprehensive picture of how the Normans consolidated their conquest into lasting governance. The process of state-building during this period demonstrates the multidimensional nature of conquest. Victory in battle, exemplified by Hastings, was only the initial phase. The effective exercise of authority depended on structured administration, territorial control, and integration of local and ecclesiastical institutions. Normandy's approach illustrates a model in which military, social, economic, and religious mechanisms were interlinked to achieve durable control in a previously decentralized polity. Effective governance required detailed knowledge of resources, prompting systematic surveys, fiscal management, and administrative reform that would shape the structure of Norman England in the decades following conquest. Doomsday was conquest turned into data. In 1086, William I commissioned the Doomsday Survey, a comprehensive assessment of England's landholding, resources, and taxable capacity. The survey represents a milestone in medieval administration, reflecting both the logistical capabilities of the Norman state and a sophisticated understanding of governance. By systematically cataloging estates, populations, and fiscal obligations, William transformed military conquest into a framework for sustainable authority. Doomsday demonstrates the intersection of conquest, bureaucracy, and feudal governance in a period previously characterized by regional autonomy and fragmented authority. The Doomsday Survey covered most of England south of the Tees and across the Midlands, excluding only parts of the north still recovering from previous rebellions. Royal commissioners traveled to hundreds of local jurisdictions, recording information from tenants-in-chief, local lords, and representative freemen. The survey enumerated landholdings, livestock, mills, fisheries, and other economic assets, as well as obligations such as knight service and rents. This process codified the fiscal and military obligations of landholders, providing William with precise intelligence for taxation, conscription, and governance. The methodology of Doomsday was both rigorous and structured. Commissioners cross-referenced oral testimony, existing charters, and local records, often corroborating statements through multiple witnesses. Entries typically distinguished between holdings under the king, tenants-in-chief, and subtenants, reflecting the layered feudal hierarchy that William had imposed. The attention to detail indicates a sophisticated administrative apparatus capable of processing and preserving extensive quantitative information across diverse regions. Landholding patterns documented in Doomsday reveal both continuity and innovation. While many estates retained traditional Anglo-Saxon boundaries and tenurial structures, Norman redistribution of land is clearly evident. Large estates previously held by Anglo-Saxon nobles were reallocated to Norman tenants-in-chief, consolidating loyalty and securing control over key strategic regions. The survey provides evidence for the integration of these new lords into established economic networks, highlighting how conquest and continuity coexisted in the restructured political landscape. Fiscal implications were central to the survey's purpose. By quantifying taxable resources, William ensured efficient extraction of revenue to fund administration, military campaigns, and infrastructure. Doomsday entries detail geld obligations, feudal dues, and the expected provision of knights, enabling precise enforcement of obligations. The systematic approach to taxation strengthened royal authority, reduced ambiguity in fiscal administration, and reinforced the hierarchical obligations underpinning Norman governance. The Doomsday Book also provides insight into social and economic structures. Information on peasants, villeins, freemen, and serfs illustrates the stratified nature of English society under Norman rule. Agricultural resources, including ploughlands, meadows, and pasture, are meticulously catalogued, demonstrating the Crown's interest in maximizing productivity and assessing economic potential. This data allowed the monarchy to anticipate and mitigate regional challenges, such as shortfalls in production or resistance to feudal obligations. Administrative organization revealed by Doomsday illustrates the integration of central authority with local governance. Sheriffs and royal officials played a crucial role in facilitating the survey, collecting data, and ensuring compliance. Charters and administrative records confirm that these officials were accountable to the Crown, providing a mechanism for oversight and enforcement across hundreds of jurisdictions. This structure exemplifies how Norman governance extended ducal authority into formerly decentralized regions, institutionalizing a system of bureaucratic oversight. The use of Doomsday as a legal instrument was equally significant. The survey provided evidence for land disputes, rights of succession, and obligations owed to the crown. In subsequent years, courts relied on doomsday records to adjudicate claims, illustrating its role not merely as a fiscal instrument but as a foundation for law and order. This demonstrates that Norman administration emphasized documentation and codification as mechanisms for legitimizing authority and resolving conflict. The compilation of doomsday required substantial coordination and communication. Royal commissioners had to traverse diverse linguistic and cultural regions, interact with Anglo-Saxon and Norman lords, and reconcile local customs with centralized expectations. The survival of detailed records across multiple counties reflects both administrative diligence and the importance placed on accuracy. Doomsday represents one of the earliest examples in medieval Europe of a state using systematic data collection to underpin governance. Doomsday's content also sheds light on Norman strategies of control and integration. Strategic emphasis on key counties, river valleys, and economically productive areas illustrates the Crown's prioritization of resources. The survey captures both the extent of Norman conquest and the ongoing need for administrative supervision in newly acquired regions. By documenting who controlled land and what obligations were owed, William transformed conquest into a mechanism for enduring authority. Archaeological evidence supports Doomsday's depiction of Norman administrative transformation. The establishment of new manorial centers, castle-adjacent settlements, and reorganized agricultural estates corresponds closely with survey entries. Material culture, including early Norman coinage, fortified residences, and estate boundaries, aligns with Doomsday's systematic recording, indicating that the survey accurately reflected contemporary governance practices and resource allocation. Doomsday also demonstrates the integration of ecclesiastical structures into state administration. Monastic houses and cathedral chapters are recorded as landholders, their assets and obligations carefully catalogued. This reflects the dual role of the Church as both spiritual authority and participant in the feudal hierarchy. Collaboration between secular and ecclesiastical authorities enhanced administrative capacity, provided legitimacy to the survey, and reinforced Norman integration of traditional structures into a centralized framework. The survey's long-term significance lies in its capacity to transform the state's operational capabilities. By providing a comprehensive record of resources, obligations, and social structure, William created a baseline for fiscal, legal, and military administration. Doomsday exemplifies the broader trend in Norman governance of integrating conquest with systemic management, linking military success with bureaucratic sophistication. This administrative transformation enabled subsequent rulers to maintain control, manage crises, and expand authority efficiently. Doomsday illustrates that consolidation of power relied as much on information and organization as on military might. By converting territorial conquest into structured data, William ensured that the Crown possessed both intelligence and instruments of enforcement. The survey demonstrates that successful governance in post-conquest England required coordination between central authority, local administration, and ecclesiastical structures, transforming the kingdom from a loosely governed collection of estates into a tightly integrated political entity. Administrative strength enabled expansion elsewhere, providing the infrastructure and authority necessary for military campaigns, economic management, and integration of England into broader Norman and European political networks. Normans built a kingdom at the crossroads of civilizations. By the early 11th century, groups of Norman mercenaries, originally itinerant knights and adventurers from northern France, had established a foothold in southern Italy. Initially employed by Lombard princes and Byzantine authorities, these soldiers of fortune leveraged military skill, feudal cohesion, and strategic opportunism to consolidate territorial control. Contemporary sources, including Amadis of Monte Cassino, William of Apulia, and the Chronica Monasterii Cassinensis, provide detailed accounts of Norman campaigns, illustrating both martial efficiency and the gradual formation of political structures capable of sustaining long-term authority. The early Norman presence in Apulia and Calabria relied on contracts known as condat, in which mercenaries were granted land or payment in exchange for military service. Archaeological evidence, including fortified hilltop settlements and early motte and bailey structures, indicates that these initial deployments were not temporary but intended as durable bases for expansion. Through a combination of conquest and diplomacy, Normans gradually supplanted local Lombard and Byzantine authorities, demonstrating adaptability to the complex political landscape of southern Italy. The rise of the Hauteville family exemplifies this transition from mercenary activity to dynastic rule. Leaders such as Robert Guiscard and Roger I systematically expanded Norman authority, employing both military campaigns and negotiated settlements. Robert Guiscard's conquest of Calabria and Apulia between 1053 and 1085 consolidated Norman dominance, while Roger I's campaigns in Sicily, culminating in its full incorporation by 1091, established a new kingdom that combined Norman governance with existing Byzantine and Arab administrative practices. Norman administration in southern Italy and Sicily exhibited remarkable sophistication and cultural adaptability. Governance incorporated multiple legal traditions, including Lombard, Byzantine, and Islamic precedents, accommodating a heterogeneous population of Latin Christians, Greek-speaking Byzantines, Muslims, and Jews. Contemporary charters and legal codices reveal the deliberate maintenance of local laws alongside feudal structures imposed by the Normans, illustrating a pragmatic approach to rule that emphasized stability and loyalty over uniformity. Military organization under the Hautevilles reflected both feudal and professional principles. Knights formed the core of offensive operations, supported by infantry levies drawn from local populations. Fortifications, including hilltop castles and urban citadels, served defensive, administrative, and symbolic functions, signaling Norman authority and providing secure bases for operations across diverse territories. Archaeological surveys of sites such as Melfi, Troia, and Palermo confirm extensive construction projects consistent with strategic consolidation of conquered regions. Economic integration was central to sustaining Norman power. Sicily, in particular, benefited from its Mediterranean position, facilitating trade in grain, textiles, and luxury goods. Normans maintained existing port infrastructure and taxation systems, ensuring continuity of revenue streams while imposing feudal dues on newly acquired territories. Administrative records indicate that royal officials coordinated collection, adjudicated disputes, and managed estates in accordance with both local custom and Norman feudal principles, underscoring the adaptability of governance mechanisms. The Hautevilles' approach to religion also reinforced political authority. Normans supported Latin ecclesiastical institutions while accommodating Byzantine and Muslim religious practices, establishing a pluralistic framework that mitigated resistance. Foundations such as the Abbey of Monte Cassino played a central role in cultural and administrative life, serving as centers of literacy, record-keeping, and elite education. Charters document both endowments and legal privileges, highlighting the intertwining of religious, administrative, and political functions. Diplomacy was equally critical to the Norman success in southern Italy and Sicily. Alliances with the papacy, Byzantine authorities, and local aristocracies allowed the Normans to secure recognition of their territorial gains while managing external threats. Papal correspondence confirms formal investiture of Norman rulers, legitimizing their authority in the eyes of both local populations and European peers. Such diplomatic strategies complemented military dominance, reinforcing a durable and broadly recognized framework of rule. Cultural synthesis was a defining feature of Norman Sicily. Architecture, administration, and art reflect a deliberate blending of Latin, Byzantine, and Islamic elements. Surviving palaces, mosaics, and fortifications demonstrate technical proficiency and aesthetic integration, signaling both political authority and engagement with diverse cultural traditions. This multicultural approach facilitated governance, ensuring that minority populations remained productive participants in the kingdom's political, economic, and social systems. The conquest and administration of southern Italy and Sicily also illustrate the mobility and adaptability of Norman elites. Leaders such as Robert Guiscard and Roger I transplanted administrative models from Normandy, modified to local conditions, combining feudal hierarchy with practical governance. Written records, including charters, diplomas, and administrative codices, indicate that Normans maintained oversight through appointed officials, military garrisons, and ecclesiastical partnerships, ensuring central authority despite geographic dispersion. The creation of the Kingdom of Sicily in 1130 by Roger II formalized this process, uniting diverse territories under a single crown. Governance structures included centralized taxation, judicial administration, and military organization, while retaining local legal traditions. The kingdom's economic vitality and administrative sophistication enabled the Normans to project power across the central Mediterranean, illustrating the strategic significance of integrating conquest, bureaucracy, and cultural accommodation. Norman engagement in southern Italy and Sicily also reflects broader patterns of expansion. Initial mercenary service evolved into territorial acquisition, dynastic rule, and state building, demonstrating a consistent application of military skill, feudal organization, and administrative foresight. Contemporary accounts emphasize both the martial capabilities of Norman knights and the strategic diplomacy employed by the Hautevilles to consolidate and legitimize authority. The Norman Kingdom of Sicily serves as a case study in adaptive governance. By integrating multiple legal systems, accommodating diverse populations, and maintaining a professionalized military and administrative apparatus, the Normans established a polity capable of sustaining authority across a culturally complex region. Archaeological, textual, and architectural evidence collectively highlight the deliberate design and operational capacity underlying Norman rule, emphasizing a synthesis of conquest and structured governance. Norman ambition extended even further east, influencing Mediterranean politics, crusader endeavors, and the broader expansion of Norman influence into strategic regions such as the Levant and southern France. Crusade and conquest followed familiar Norman patterns. By the late 11th century, the Normans had established durable polities in England, southern Italy, and Sicily. Their military skill, organizational discipline, and feudal cohesion positioned them to participate actively in the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099. Contemporary chronicles, including those of Albert of Aachen, William of Tyre, and Orderic Vitalis, document Norman engagement, particularly the role of Bohemond of Taranto and his relatives, highlighting the intersection of personal ambition, dynastic expansion, and religiously sanctioned warfare. Bohemond, a scion of the Hauteville family, exemplifies the extension of Norman strategic patterns into the eastern Mediterranean. Initially Count of Apulia, Bohemond capitalized on both Norman martial tradition and familial networks to secure leadership roles within the Crusader army. His participation demonstrates the continuity of Norman approaches to military and political authority, disciplined troop organization, flexible tactical planning, and the use of both coercion and negotiation to achieve objectives. Norman participation in the Crusade was motivated by a combination of religious obligation, political opportunity, and dynastic ambition. Papal calls to arms, articulated in letters and sermons of Urban II, framed participation as both a penitential and prestigious enterprise. At the same time, Normans viewed the expedition as a mechanism to extend influence, secure land, and establish principalities in regions lacking centralized authority. The dual incentives of spiritual reward and tangible political gain mirror strategies employed during prior expansions in England and southern Italy. Norman contingents were integrated into broader Crusader forces, cooperating with French, Flemish, and other European armies. Tactical proficiency and heavy cavalry, hallmarks of Norman warfare, provided decisive advantages in both pitched battles and sieges. The Siege of Antioch, 1097 to 1098, illustrates the application of these skills. Norman knights maintained disciplined formations, coordinated assaults, and engineered siege works in coordination with allied contingents. Chroniclers note that Norman leadership was instrumental in sustaining cohesion during protracted operations, reflecting both command capability and institutionalized martial culture. Bohemond's leadership also demonstrates the adaptive use of diplomacy alongside military action. In Antioch, for instance, he negotiated with local Byzantine officials and Muslim authorities to secure supplies, intelligence, and tactical advantage. These maneuvers reveal an understanding of the interplay between force and negotiation, echoing earlier Norman practices in southern Italy and Sicily, where conquest relied on both military initiative and strategic alliances with local elites. The establishment of Norman principalities in the Levant reflects both conquest and administrative foresight. Following the capture of Antioch, Bohemond assumed the title of Prince of Antioch, instituting governance structures modeled on Norman feudal principles. Charters, contemporary correspondence, and subsequent chronicles describe the appointment of deputies, fortification of key towns, and integration of local populations into feudal hierarchies. These measures parallel the strategies employed in southern Italy, indicating the transferability of Norman statecraft across regions. Norman expansion during the Crusades had significant implications for regional geopolitics. Their control of key fortifications along trade routes enhanced economic capacity, facilitated mobilization of troops, and created stable nodes of authority in contested territories. The administrative structures established by Bohemond and his successors reflect both innovation and continuity, integrating local legal traditions with feudal obligations, while ensuring that loyalty and military service remained central to governance. Participation in the crusade also carried risks for dynastic cohesion. Extended campaigns and distant principalities imposed logistical, political, and succession challenges. Bohemond's departure from Italy and focus on Antioch created temporary gaps in regional authority, necessitating reliance on family members or loyal deputies to maintain control. Contemporary sources, including letters and charters, document both internal tensions and practical solutions, illustrating the balancing act required to sustain authority across multiple theaters of influence. The Normans' engagement in the Crusades reinforced their reputation for disciplined military organization. Heavy cavalry, fortified encampments, and the integration of combined arms tactics contributed to battlefield success, while diplomatic engagement ensured sustainability of territorial gains. Chroniclers repeatedly highlight Norman initiative and effectiveness, attributing decisive outcomes to both martial skill and strategic planning. Religious legitimacy played a key role in Norman participation. Papal endorsement provided not only spiritual sanction but also practical benefits, including justification for territorial acquisition and recruitment support. Normans, like other European contingents, framed their actions in terms of divine obligation, yet contemporaneous records indicate that political pragmatism guided decisions regarding governance, resource allocation, and interaction with local populations. The outcomes of Norman involvement in the First Crusade were both immediate and enduring. The Principality of Antioch became a durable Norman polity in the Levant, extending their influence beyond Europe and the central Mediterranean. Governance structures, feudal organization, and administrative practices established by Norman rulers in Antioch mirrored those of southern Italy and Sicily, demonstrating the portability of Norman statecraft across geographically and culturally distinct regions. Norman strategies also influenced broader Crusader politics. By establishing autonomous principalities under dynastic leadership, they contributed to a pattern of decentralized authority that shaped subsequent governance in the Latin East. Relationships with neighboring Crusader states, Byzantine authorities, and Muslim polities were mediated through a combination of military preparedness, strategic marriage alliances, and negotiated agreements, reflecting the continuity of Norman methods in both conquest and consolidation. Participation in the Crusade further reinforced the interconnection between martial prowess, dynastic ambition, and administrative capacity. The Normans' ability to mobilize forces, maintain cohesion, and institutionalize authority demonstrates a systematic approach to expansion. Bohemond's career exemplifies the combination of military acumen, political negotiation, and administrative foresight necessary to transform ephemeral conquest into sustainable rule. The structural lessons of Norman involvement in the Crusades are consistent with their broader historical trajectory. Campaigns were never isolated military actions. They were integrated into existing patterns of feudal governance, resource management, and strategic diplomacy. Normans consistently combined personal leadership, loyalty networks, and institutional structures to create effective, enduring control over diverse territories. Expansion increased strain on dynastic cohesion, requiring careful management of succession, administration, and inter-family relations, setting the stage for internal challenges and consolidation in both European and Mediterranean domains. Norman power fractured along family lines. The death of William the Conqueror in 1087 initiated a period of dynastic division that would profoundly affect Norman authority in England, Normandy, and continental holdings. William's territories were partitioned between his sons, with Robert Curthose receiving the Duchy of Normandy and William Rufus assuming the English crown. Contemporary chronicles, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Ord Eric Vitalis, and William of Malmesbury, provide detailed accounts of these divisions, documenting disputes over succession, territorial rights, and political prerogatives. The resulting instability demonstrates the vulnerability of even a highly organized feudal system to intradynastic conflict. Robert Curthose' rule in Normandy was marked by intermittent assertion of authority and financial strain. As Duke, Robert faced the dual challenge of maintaining ducal governance while managing relations with his brother, William Rufus, who controlled England. Norman charters and fiscal records reveal Robert's frequent need to mortgage estates, seek alliances, and negotiate truces, indicating both economic limitations and the pressure of sustaining loyalty among vassals. His frequent absences, including participation in the First Crusade, further weakened central control and provided openings for dissent among Norman barons. William Rufus, in contrast, consolidated power in England with a combination of military readiness and administrative reform. Chronicles detail his efforts to reinforce royal authority through castle construction, appointment of loyal sheriffs, and strategic exploitation of revenues. Despite these measures, the division of familial territories created a persistent tension. Robert's claims to the English crown and Rufus's claims over Normandy required careful diplomacy and, at times, armed confrontation, perpetuating an environment of uncertainty across the Anglo-Norman realm. Conflicts between the brothers were mediated intermittently through negotiation, papal arbitration, and, occasionally, armed campaigns. The Battle of Tinchebray in 1106, when Henry I, who had seized the English throne following William Rufus's death, defeated Robert Curthose, underscores the culmination of these dynastic tensions. Surviving chronicles document the strategic coordination of forces, castle sieges, and logistical planning that allowed Henry to unify England and Normandy temporarily, though the underlying fragility of Norman succession persisted. The dynastic division also generated localized instability. Barons and vassals, often holding estates on both sides of the Channel, faced conflicting obligations to competing sovereigns. Domesday-era records and subsequent charters illustrate disputes over land tenure, military service, and taxation. These tensions occasionally manifested in rebellion, with regional magnates exploiting periods of ducal absence or succession disputes to assert autonomy. The resulting fragmentation demonstrates the structural vulnerability of a feudal system that relied heavily on personal loyalty and hierarchical obligation. Economic pressures further exacerbated political strain. Normandy and England, though closely connected, operated with partially distinct fiscal systems. Disparities in revenue collection, land productivity, and taxation policies created incentives for administrative inefficiency or evasion. Charters and financial records indicate that both ducal and royal authorities struggled to balance expenditure on military defense, castle maintenance, and court administration against the need to maintain baronial loyalty, creating recurring financial tension across the Anglo-Norman domain. The role of the Church in mediating dynastic conflict was significant. Bishops and abbots served as both advisors and intermediaries, documenting oaths of fealty, witnessing agreements, and facilitating communication across territories. Papal correspondence and ecclesiastical chronicles indicate that church officials occasionally exerted pressure to maintain peace, legitimize claims, and endorse territorial transfers. While these interventions often mitigated conflict, they could not fully resolve underlying dynastic rivalries or prevent armed confrontation. Marital alliances and inheritance practices also influenced the pattern of division. William the Conqueror's preference for partition among multiple sons, rather than primogeniture, created overlapping claims that were difficult to reconcile. Subsequent arrangements, including strategic marriages of daughters and relatives to regional lords, were intended to stabilize holdings but often introduced new claims or entanglements. Charters and marriage contracts highlight the deliberate, yet sometimes counterproductive, use of dynastic strategy to secure loyalty and political integration. Robert Curthose's participation in the First Crusade added further strain to dynastic cohesion. His prolonged absence weakened ducal authority in Normandy, prompting baronial assertions of autonomy and complicating coordination with England. Records of Norman governance during this period indicate an increased reliance on deputies and local officials, yet these measures could not fully compensate for the lack of centralized oversight. The consequences of absent leadership illustrate the inherent fragility of feudal governance when succession is divided among multiple heirs. The death of William Rufus in 1100 further intensified political pressure. Henry I's rapid assumption of the English crown, supported by key nobles and ecclesiastical figures, reflects both the opportunistic nature of succession and the necessity of decisive action to prevent prolonged instability. Contemporary accounts detail Henry's use of castles, loyal retainers, and strategic alliances to secure authority, emphasizing that military preparedness and administrative control were inseparable in the maintenance of power. Despite periods of relative stability, the fragmentation of Norman holdings had long-term consequences. Dynastic disputes diverted resources from external expansion, weakened the enforcement of feudal obligations, and created openings for rebellion. Chroniclers repeatedly note that barons exploited these tensions, sometimes siding with one claimant against another or pursuing independent objectives. These dynamics illustrate the systemic vulnerability of a polity reliant on personal loyalty and hierarchical feudal networks. The division of the Anglo-Norman realm also had implications for international relations. French kings, neighboring counts, and other European rulers monitored succession disputes, seeking to influence outcomes to their advantage. Diplomatic correspondence and military alliances reveal that internal Norman weakness invited external pressure, forcing rulers to balance domestic control with the threat of intervention from external powers. The interconnection of dynastic stability and international security underscores the strategic importance of consolidated authority. By the mid-12th century, the unification of England and Normandy under Henry I temporarily resolved these tensions, yet underlying structural fragility remained. Succession planning, feudal obligations, and the distribution of territories continued to shape political dynamics. Legal codification, castle networks, and ecclesiastical alliances mitigated immediate risks, but the precedent of divided inheritance persisted as a source of potential instability for future generations. Internal weakness invited external pressure, creating vulnerabilities along the Channel and in continental holdings that would challenge Norman authority and foreshadow eventual territorial contraction. Normandy fell not by invasion, but by isolation. By the early 13th century, the Duchy of Normandy had become increasingly vulnerable to French royal authority. The political and administrative divergence between England and continental holdings weakened ducal control, leaving the region exposed to annexation by the Cape Town monarchy. Contemporary sources, including chronicles by William the Breton, Roger of Hoveden, and administrative correspondence preserved in the cartulary of Rouen, document the processes that undermined Norman authority, illustrating that the loss of Normandy was as much a consequence of political fragmentation and neglect as it was of external military pressure. The origins of Normandy's vulnerability can be traced to the reign of King John of England, 1199 to 1216. John inherited a duchy already weakened by prior succession disputes, limited resources, and declining feudal cohesion. English kings increasingly focused their attention on domestic governance, fiscal extraction, and continental campaigns elsewhere, leaving Normandy administratively neglected. Letters and charters from the period reveal that local barons grew increasingly autonomous, often acting independently of the English crown, which undermined centralized authority. The French monarchy under Philip II Augustus capitalized on these structural weaknesses. Philip employed a combination of diplomacy, legal claims, and targeted military action to assert suzerainty over Norman territories. Cape Town propaganda emphasized the illegitimacy of John's rule over continental lands, citing prior oaths of homage and feudal obligations. Contemporary correspondence and royal charters illustrate that Philip's strategy prioritized legal justification and political isolation rather than immediate conquest, highlighting the nuanced approach employed by the French crown. Administrative divergence between England and Normandy played a crucial role in facilitating the duchy's fall. While England maintained a centralized system of sheriffs, itinerant justices, and the exchequer to enforce law and collect revenue, Normandy operated under a separate, semi-autonomous ducal administration. Charters, land surveys, and legal codes indicate that English oversight was inconsistent, particularly in the western and northern regions of the duchy, where barons managed estates with considerable independence. This separation impeded coordination, weakened enforcement of ducal authority, and limited the capacity to mobilize resources against external threats. Feudal disunity exacerbated the problem. Norman barons, often holding lands in both England and Normandy, faced conflicting obligations and incentives. Many were reluctant to commit troops or resources in support of the English crown, particularly as Philip cultivated alliances through marriage, gifts, and recognition of local privileges. Chronological accounts demonstrate that internal dissent and selective allegiance among the nobility accelerated the erosion of ducal authority and reduced the effectiveness of military resistance. Philip II's military campaigns, conducted from 1202 to 1204, exploited these vulnerabilities. Castles in strategic locations, including Rouen, Caen, and Bayeux, were either surrendered under negotiated terms or fell after limited sieges. Archaeological surveys of fortifications from this period indicate that while many castles remained intact, their garrisons were insufficient to resist coordinated French forces. This evidence underscores that Normandy's fall was facilitated less by catastrophic battle than by isolation, administrative weakness, and local acquiescence. Economic factors also contributed to territorial contraction. Normandy's fiscal base had declined due to years of English mismanagement, warfare, and inconsistent taxation. Fiscal records and account rolls preserved from the late 12th century reveal gaps in revenue collection, underutilized estates, and localized resistance to feudal dues. This economic erosion limited the duchy's capacity to fund fortifications, hire mercenaries, or sustain prolonged defense, further enhancing Philip's strategic advantage. Diplomatic maneuvering played an equally critical role. Philip negotiated alliances with disaffected barons, granted recognition to key nobles who defected, and leveraged legal claims to assert ducal authority over contested lands. Letters and charters from the period document these arrangements, emphasizing that the fall of Normandy was as much a consequence of political strategy and negotiation as of direct military confrontation. Local elites, recognizing the impracticality of sustained opposition, increasingly aligned with the French crown, reinforcing the gradual contraction of English control. The administrative consequences of the loss were profound. England and Normandy diverged permanently in governance, law, and fiscal policy. Norman institutions were absorbed into the French administrative framework, including the extension of royal justices, taxation systems, and legal oversight. The Assize of Normandy and other legal codices illustrate how customary law was preserved selectively, but under the ultimate authority of the Capetian monarchy. This integration highlights the adaptive strategies employed by Philip to consolidate authority while maintaining elements of continuity. Normandy's decline also had strategic implications for England. The loss of continental territories reduced cross-channel influence, limited access to resources, and altered diplomatic relations with France. Chroniclers note that English monarchs faced increased vulnerability in foreign policy, with diminished capacity to project military power on the continent. These pressures contributed to subsequent domestic challenges, including baronial revolts and financial strain, linking territorial contraction directly to internal stability. Cultural and social continuity persisted despite political change. Norman institutions, legal traditions, and ecclesiastical networks continued to operate under French sovereignty. Charters, monastic records, and urban governance structures illustrate that while the ducal lineage of the English crown no longer ruled, the administrative framework established by centuries of Norman governance endured, shaping local practice and long-term development. The fall of Normandy illustrates a broader principle in medieval statecraft. Territorial control depended not solely on military strength, but on sustained administrative presence, coherent feudal obligations, and strategic alignment of local elites. Normandy's decline was the result of cumulative structural weaknesses, compounded by the strategic acumen of the Capetian monarchy and the limitations of English oversight. Archaeological, fiscal, and documentary evidence collectively reinforce the interpretation that isolation, rather than overwhelming force, precipitated the duchy's absorption into France. By 1204, the loss of Normandy marked the end of a significant chapter in Norman expansion. English kings retained domestic authority, but the continental holdings that had facilitated dynastic influence, military recruitment, and cross-channel cohesion were permanently ceded. This contraction reshaped the political map of northwestern Europe and defined the limits of Anglo-Norman power for the subsequent century. Political decline did not erase Norman influence, which continued to shape law, governance, military organization, and cultural identity across England, southern Italy, Sicily, and the Crusader states, leaving a legacy that outlasted territorial contraction. The Normans reshaped institutions wherever they ruled. The influence of the Normans extended far beyond military conquest, leaving enduring marks on governance, legal frameworks, architecture, and military organization across Europe. Their systematic approach to administration, evidence-based fiscal management, and strategic application of feudal structures produced models of centralized authority that persisted for centuries. Contemporary sources, including charters, monastic chronicles, and legal codices, alongside archaeological evidence from castles, urban centers, and ecclesiastical buildings, illustrate the scale and sophistication of Norman impact. In governance, the Normans emphasized the integration of conquest with administrative oversight. In England, Domesday Book, 1086, exemplifies this methodology, documenting land tenure, taxation, and feudal obligations with unprecedented precision. Similar administrative principles were applied in southern Italy, Sicily, and the Crusader states, where Norman rulers adapted local institutions while imposing feudal hierarchies. Charters and letters from these regions reveal coordinated appointment of officials, systematic revenue collection, and the establishment of judicial authority, demonstrating the adaptability and transferability of Norman administrative models. The legal contributions of the Normans also had enduring consequences. By codifying land tenure, feudal obligations, and rights of vassalage, they reinforced hierarchical governance while providing mechanisms for dispute resolution. English common law, particularly in its reliance on precedent and documentation, reflects this Norman foundation. Evidence from continental holdings, including Sicily and southern Italy, shows parallel development of hybrid legal systems that merged Norman, Lombard, Byzantine, and Islamic practices, underscoring the Normans' pragmatic approach to governance across diverse populations. Architectural innovation is another hallmark of Norman influence. The construction of motte and bailey castles, stone keeps, and fortified urban centers provided both military security and administrative control. Archaeological excavations at sites such as the Tower of London, Rochester Castle, and Melfi demonstrate standardized construction techniques, adaptation to local topography, and integration with surrounding settlements. These fortifications were not merely defensive structures. They functioned as centers of lordship, fiscal administration, and symbolic authority, reinforcing political hierarchy and consolidating power over both conquered and integrated territories. Ecclesiastical patronage further reinforced Norman authority and cultural influence. Monastic foundations, including Jumiages, Fécamp, Monte Cassino, and Palermo's cathedral complex, combined religious, educational, and administrative functions. Charters and donation records document the endowment of land, rights, and privileges to monasteries, establishing networks of literate, loyal clerics capable of administering estates, recording legal transactions, and supporting governance. The Norman support for reform movements, including Cluniac and Gregorian initiatives, fostered religious standardization and cultural integration, linking political authority with ecclesiastical legitimacy. Norman military organization was similarly influential. Heavy cavalry, disciplined infantry, and coordinated siegecraft formed the backbone of their campaigns across England, southern Italy, Sicily, and the Levant. Contemporary accounts, including the Bayeux Tapestry and Chronicles by William of Tyre, highlight structured deployment, chain-of-command procedures, and logistical planning, demonstrating that Norman conquest relied on institutionalized military capability rather than ad hoc force. Fortified positions, garrisoned castles, and professional retainers enabled sustained control over territories, setting a precedent for medieval European military administration. Economic and fiscal structures under the Normans also left a lasting legacy. Revenue collection was organized through centralized offices, regularized taxation and assessment of productive assets, enabling rulers to fund administration, military campaigns, and infrastructure. Domesday Book exemplifies this approach in England, while charters and fiscal records in Sicily and southern Italy demonstrate equivalent systems adapted to local contexts. By linking economic assessment with governance, the Normans institutionalized state capacity and ensured the viability of their territorial holdings. Culturally, the Normans acted as agents of synthesis. In Sicily, for example, Latin, Greek, and Islamic traditions were integrated in architecture, administrative practice, and urban planning. Palaces, mosaics, and legal codices from Palermo and Messina reflect a deliberate blending of stylistic and institutional elements, illustrating pragmatic accommodation of diverse populations. Similar patterns are evident in the Crusader states, where Norman practices merged with Byzantine and local traditions to establish functional governance in multi-ethnic contexts. The Normans' approach to succession, land tenure, and feudal loyalty reinforced long-term stability, even as dynastic disputes periodically disrupted control. By codifying obligations, formalizing inheritance practices, and establishing hierarchical networks of vassalage, they created durable institutional frameworks. Charters, oaths of fealty, and administrative correspondence document these mechanisms, showing that authority depended not solely on personal leadership, but on predictable, enforceable structures. Norman influence also extended to urban development. The establishment of planned towns, markets, and fortified boroughs supported both economic productivity and political control. Archaeological studies in Rouen, Palermo, and Exeter reveal street layouts, market centers, and civic fortifications consistent with Norman administrative priorities. Such urban planning facilitated taxation, resource distribution, and centralized oversight, contributing to long-term institutional resilience. Educational and literary institutions benefited from Norman patronage as well. Monasteries, cathedrals, and court centers produced legal codices, chronicles, and administrative manuals that reinforced governance and cultural cohesion. Surviving documents attest to the integration of literacy into governance, enabling record-keeping, adjudication of disputes, and transmission of law across regions. This emphasis on documentation and literacy was a hallmark of Norman administration, linking institutional strength to cultural development. Norman impact was not limited to Europe. Their participation in the Crusades and governance of Levantine principalities exemplified the application of Norman structures in distant and culturally complex regions. Bohemond of Taranto and other leaders implemented feudal hierarchies, military organization, and administrative oversight analogous to southern Italy and England, demonstrating the portability of Norman statecraft. Chronicles and charters from Antioch and surrounding territories confirm the integration of local populations into these frameworks, highlighting adaptability as a core element of Norman influence. The cumulative effect of these institutional and cultural innovations was the creation of a legacy that persisted long after the decline of dynastic power. Legal frameworks, military structures, administrative practices, and architectural norms established under Norman authority continued to shape European governance and culture throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. The Normans' integration of conquest with institutional development provides a model for understanding the interplay between military expansion, governance, and cultural synthesis in medieval Europe. Legacy invites scholarly reassessment, prompting analysis not only of military conquest but of the enduring institutional, cultural, and administrative imprint that the Normans left on medieval Europe, from England to Sicily, and into the eastern Mediterranean. The Normans did not endure as a people, but their systems did. Modern historical scholarship consistently emphasizes that the Normans' lasting significance lies less in ethnic continuity and more in the institutions, administrative practices, and cultural synthesis they established across Europe and the Mediterranean. Historians such as David Crouch, Eleanor Searle, and Richard Abels have highlighted the Normans' capacity for adaptive governance, their integration into existing political structures, and the durability of their military and legal frameworks. Archaeological evidence, documentary records, and comparative studies demonstrate that while the Norman ethnic identity gradually merged with local populations, the systemic innovations they implemented persisted for generations. One central scholarly debate concerns Norman identity and assimilation. Early medieval sources, including Orderic Vitalis and William of Jumiages, often emphasize Scandinavian origins, martial culture, and a distinctive aristocratic ethos. Modern historians, however, recognize that by the late 11th and 12th centuries, the Normans had adopted the language, religion, and cultural norms of the regions they ruled. In England, for example, Norman French blended with Anglo-Saxon administrative structures, while in Sicily, Norman rulers accommodated Latin, Greek, and Islamic traditions in both governance and architecture. This process of assimilation illustrates a strategic flexibility that enabled effective rule across diverse territories. Scholarship also examines the Normans' contribution to state formation. Their combination of centralized authority, hierarchical vassalage, and systematic administration created durable political entities. In England, the implementation of doomsday surveys, legal codification, and castle networks exemplifies the integration of conquest with bureaucratic oversight. Comparative studies in southern Italy and the Crusader states reveal parallel approaches, demonstrating that Norman methods of statecraft were portable and adaptable to different geographic and cultural contexts. Historians argue that this adaptability explains why Norman institutions often outlasted the dynastic or ethnic groups that established them. Military historians highlight the institutionalization of Norman martial organization. Heavy cavalry, disciplined infantry, and coordinated siegecraft were hallmarks of their campaigns. Yet scholars note that these capabilities were inseparable from feudal and administrative structures. The ability to mobilize, sustain, and command forces depended on hierarchical networks, revenue collection, and loyal retainers. Analyses of sources such as the Bayeux Tapestry, Chronicles of Southern Italy, and Crusader accounts show that Norman military success was not merely a product of personal valor but of systemic organization. Economic and fiscal assessments underscore the Normans' impact on medieval governance. Scholars emphasize the integration of taxation, land tenure, and resource management into durable administrative systems. Charters, account rolls, and urban development records indicate that revenues were linked to military, judicial, and ecclesiastical obligations. The creation of standardized administrative procedures allowed Norman rulers to extract and redistribute resources efficiently, sustaining both political control and infrastructural development. Historians consider this fiscal innovation a major factor in the Normans' ability to maintain authority across widespread territories. The Normans' architectural and cultural legacies are similarly well documented. Archaeological surveys of castles, cathedrals, and urban fortifications reveal consistent patterns of design, strategic placement, and multifunctional usage. These constructions served as military strongpoints, centers of administration, and symbols of authority. Monastic foundations and cathedral schools facilitated literacy, legal administration, and cultural continuity, demonstrating that Norman influence extended beyond coercive power into institutional and cultural realms. Scholars also debate the degree to which Norman rule was imposed versus negotiated with local populations. Evidence from southern Italy and Sicily suggests that pragmatic accommodation was often preferred. Byzantine and Islamic legal traditions, local customs, and urban institutions were integrated into Norman governance. Such syncretism indicates that the Normans' effectiveness derived not only from military conquest but from political and cultural negotiation, allowing them to establish authority in regions with complex social and legal landscapes. Historiographical analysis highlights a broader methodological point. Assessing Norman impact requires attention to systemic, structural, and long-term outcomes rather than short-term military events. While battles, sieges, and dynastic disputes shaped immediate political landscapes, the enduring significance of the Normans lies in the institutions they created, the legal codifications they implemented, and the administrative practices they disseminated across Europe and the Mediterranean. This perspective aligns with modern approaches to medieval history, emphasizing structural continuity over ephemeral political actors. Debates regarding the Norman model of governance continue to inform comparative studies. Scholars examine how Norman methods influenced subsequent state formation in England, Sicily, and the Crusader states, highlighting the replication of hierarchical authority, fiscal management, and military organization. This model demonstrates the Normans' capacity to export effective institutional frameworks, which served as templates for later European polities and contributed to broader trends in medieval governance. Finally, contemporary scholarship emphasizes the Normans' dual legacy. While ethnic identity gradually disappeared through assimilation, their systems of governance, military organization, legal structures, and cultural patronage persisted. England, Sicily, southern Italy, and the Crusader states retained Norman-inspired institutions long after the dynastic lineages weakened or territories changed hands. The enduring influence of these structures underscores the Normans' historical significance and justifies their study as a transformative force in medieval Europe. The cumulative historical record demonstrates that while the Normans as a distinct ethnic group did not endure, their innovations in governance, law, military organization, and cultural integration shaped the political, administrative, and social landscape of medieval Europe for centuries. By focusing on institutional endurance rather than ephemeral conquest, the scholarly consensus recognizes the Normans as architects of enduring systems rather than merely transient rulers. Before we conclude this journey through Norman history, take a moment to subscribe to Nightfall History and click the bell icon to receive daily videos exploring the full sweep of human civilization. Share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Norman legacy intrigued you the most? By engaging, you help sustain research-driven, cinematic history that brings the past into focus.